Hello everyone, happy President's Day and welcome to part 2 of my presidential tier list. No long intro this time since part 1 was very long and this will be covering even more years than that did, but it's linked in the description if you haven't seen it. I'll aim to get out part 3 by July 4th, but who knows if I'll manage that. Today's first president is Abraham Lincoln. We ended last time with Pierce and Buchanan, horrendous Democratic presidents who were very pro-slavery despite being Northerners. The North was done with these so-called moderates on slavery and unanimously voted for Lincoln in the 1860 election. Free states made up a majority of the electoral votes, and Lincoln received over 50% in all but 3 of them, so he won with ease. He would have won even if the other candidates combined their votes in every state. However, the results showed how deeply divided the country was. Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote as he had no support in the South. Meanwhile, the Democrats fractured over the issue of slavery. They nominated 2 different candidates, Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, who championed popular sovereignty as a compromise on slavery, and Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's VP and a staunch advocate for slavery everywhere in the country. Douglas was more moderate, but he was behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and caused bleed in Kansas, so anti-slavery voters correctly saw him as the enemy. As the only candidate to receive support in the North and South, he finished second in the popular vote to Lincoln, but only won one state, the slave state of Missouri. Breckinridge won most slave states, while John Bell of the Constitutional Unions, who opposed secession, took 3 in the Upper South. As mentioned last time, many slave states threatened secession after the election. Republicans refused to acquiesce to their insane demands, so the 7 states south of Tennessee seceded before Lincoln took office. After the Civil War began in April 1861, Tennessee, Arkansas, Virginia, and North Carolina also seceded. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were slave states that never seceded. From now on, when I say the South, it'll mean the states that seceded in the Civil War, and when I say the Upper South, it'll refer to places like Delaware and Maryland. But the House elections weren't as good for Republicans. Unlike in the presidential election, getting 51% in a state didn't give a party all its representatives, so Republicans only won around 70% of northern seats. And of course, they had 0 southern seats. They even lost 8 seats compared to the post-Dred Scott 1858 election. But this was still enough for a majority, even though it wasn't 2 years prior, as the number of seats decreased due to secessions. Representatives who supported secession left Congress, while anti-secession portions of seceded states, such as East Tennessee, sent quote-unquote moderates to Congress who used the Unionist label. One of these was Andrew Johnson, who would become Lincoln's second-term VP. There were 238 seats before the secessions, but as you can see, from 1861 to 1863, there were only 183. Thus, the Republicans had a majority. The 1860 census added some seats, but people like Johnson couldn't be re-elected as their states were no longer part of the Union, so the total number only increased by 1. But in the midterms, Republicans lost 21 seats in their majority, winning only 87. The early part of the war favored the Confederacy, and the taxes and inflation caused by the war were quite unpopular. Republicans did retain a plurality and governed with Unionist support. Lincoln thus chose a unity ticket for his second term to reach out to these Unionists, with the aforementioned Johnson as his VP. He did get re-elected, but was then assassinated in 1865, making Johnson president. I'll cover that election in more detail during Johnson's slides. Meanwhile, the Senate was supermajority Republican from the secessions all the way until 1876, so Lincoln had a trifecta throughout his term. Now, let's cover his term in more detail. Obviously, the Civil War was the most important event during Lincoln's presidency, so let's cover it in detail. The war began in April 1861 when Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Most of the North supported the war early on, as the Confederates were the ones who started it. Stephen Douglas, who ran against Lincoln, remarked, "Every man must be for the United States or against it. There can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors." But 4 more southern states seceded after April 1861, and the North had several early losses, starting with the First Battle of Bull Run. Lincoln appointed Democrat George McClellan as the commander of the army in the Virginia theater, but he lost at Ball's Bluff, the 7 Days Battle, and the Second Battle of Bull Run. In September 1862, the North was attacked at Antietam. They forced the Confederates to retreat, but they had more casualties even with home field advantage, and then didn't pursue the fleeing Confederate army despite still having more men. Lincoln finally fired McClellan, but all these failures, plus the inflation and taxes caused by the war, led to the midterm losses. The South won 2 more battles in Fredericksburg in December 1862 and Chancellorsville in May 1863, though Southern General Stonewall Jackson died in the latter. The turning point was the Battle of Gettysburg from July 1st to 3rd in 1863. The South tried attacking the North again, but the North finally had a decisive victory. Lincoln delivered the legendary Gettysburg Address in November on that battlefield. And battles in other regions had been going well for the Union throughout. Ulysses S. Grant led many victories in Tennessee and west of the Mississippi, such as the Siege of Vicksburg from May to July of 1863, and the Battle of Chattanooga in November 1863. He was then named the main commander of the Army in March 1864 and took over the Virginia theater. He carried the momentum that started with Gettysburg and the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and North Anna in May, Cold Harbor in June, and after a protracted siege, captured Richmond, capital of the Confederacy, on April 3, 1865. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in Appomattox, Virginia on April 9th, just before Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman led the March to the Sea in 1864, winning numerous victories in the South and freeing slaves from Atlanta to Savannah, while destroying Southern crops and cities in his Scorched Earth campaign. He then went up the coast through the Carolinas, taking back Fort Sumter in February 1865, and then forcing another Confederate General, Johnston, to surrender on April 18. And the Navy blockaded the South, limiting their ability to export cotton and receive imports. The South thus ran low on resources as the war dragged on. The blockade, combined with the North having more people, more railroads, more factories, and not having the war ruin their territory, meant that a Union victory was always inevitable, even if the early fights did not go well. I give Lincoln a neutral grade as commander-in-chief. The Telegraph meant Lincoln received information about the war faster than earlier presidents, and some criticized him for being too hands-on and causing individual battles to go poorly. But his macro strategy of a blockade and multiple offensive fronts turned out well, so overall, I think he was quite decent. Of course, what Lincoln receives the most praise for is ending slavery. He was a moderate on this issue when running for president, advocating the free soil position and not immediate abolition. This was important to not appear too radical and get elected. And once elected, the vast majority of the time, he made the right decisions on slavery. But he made it clear that he cared more about maintaining popular support and winning the war than freeing black people. A quote in a private letter sums this up. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." In his first inaugural address, before war broke out, he tried to dissuade more states from seceding and get the others to rejoin. He promised to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, saying, "There is much controversy about the delivering of fugitives. The clause is as plainly written in the Constitution as any other provision. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." It is scarcely questioned that this provision was intended for the reclaiming of fugitive slaves. All members of Congress swear their support to the whole Constitution, to this provision as much as any other. But once the war started, Lincoln changed his tone. He signed 2 confiscation acts. The first said those helping the Confederate war efforts could have their slaves taken away, and the second said slaves who fled the Confederacy were free and not subject to the Fugitive Slave Act. He also allowed Southern blacks to serve in the military and gave them freedom if they did. After the South heard about this and said they would kill all captured black soldiers, Lincoln said for every captured black soldier killed, he would kill 1 captured Confederate soldier. The Emancipation Proclamation, on Jan 1, 1863, stated that any areas currently under rebellion would have their slaves freed. From then on, after capturing an area of the South, the Union Army would free all the slaves there. These were all good and showed that over time, the war became about ending slavery and not just preserving the Union. In the foreign policy section, we'll see more benefits of this strategy. But in Union territory, Lincoln was less abolitionist. In 1861, John C. Fremont put Missouri under martial law and said anyone there who joined the rebellion would be hung by a military court and have their slaves freed. Lincoln rebuked his order and fired him. Fremont was being pretty extreme, so I don't blame Lincoln, and his first confiscation act did what Fremont wanted. But in 1862, Lincoln signed the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act. Slaveholders were paid up to $300 per slave freed, though anyone found to have aided the rebellion was not compensated. This was a prelude to what happened after emancipation everywhere. Slaves were freed, but they weren't given any reparations. Instead, those who had enslaved them were the ones given reparations, and allowed to keep all the revenues their slaves generated. The Emancipation Proclamation only mentioned areas in rebellion, so areas the Union had recaptured, like New Orleans and much of Tennessee, were not subject to it, so slaves remained chained there. When West Virginia became a state in 1863, it still had slaves. Lincoln required them to have gradual emancipation to be admitted. They may have seceded had he pushed full abolition, so I'm okay with this compromise. Then in 1864, with the war nearly over and pleasing border states no longer as important, Lincoln endorsed the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves everywhere. It wasn't originally his idea, but he was instrumental at getting it through Congress. So overall, I'll give him full marks on slavery. He didn't push total abolition immediately, but his decisions were solid, and having a more accelerated timeline would have risked losing the border states and the war. But as mentioned with compensation for slave owners and not free slaves, Lincoln was quite poor on Reconstruction, which was the process of readmitting states to the Union and deciding what rights to give freedmen. In December 1863, he came up with his 10% plan, where states could return to the Union if a population equal to 10% of their 1860 vote count took an oath of allegiance to the Union. These ex-Confederates would have all their property returned to them, besides their slaves, still be able to vote, and not serve any jail time. And Lincoln did not push for any protections or reparations for the newly freed slaves. We'll cover what happened to them in detail under Johnson, but Knowing Better has a good video where he goes very in-depth into this, which he calls neo-slavery. Lincoln never strongly supported black voting rights, and in the last speech before his assassination, the furthest he got was, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." Republicans in Congress were willing to go further. They passed the Wade-Davis bill for readmitting states, which would have given much less amnesty than Lincoln's plan, and had a governor appointed by the president before the new state constitution was written to ensure black rights would be protected. It passed Congress, but Lincoln vetoed it, showing that in this instance, he was more pro-Confederate than the average congressman. Congress then pushed the 13th Amendment, and Lincoln did strongly support that from the start, as well as the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave freed blacks better access to education, though its bank would collapse after the Panic of 1873 and rob investors of their savings. General Sherman confiscated land from Southerners and gave it to freed slaves with his Special Field Order 15, which is where the expression 40 acres and a mule came from. Lincoln didn't push for a national version of this, as he wanted slave owners to retain all their property besides their slaves, but at least he didn't undo it like Andrew Johnson later would. But we'll see after Lincoln's death, Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendments and many civil rights bills without Johnson's support. They wanted blacks to have more rights than Lincoln did and deserve way more credit than him. Thus, Lincoln receives poor marks on Reconstruction. He didn't lead the push for black equality besides freeing the slaves, he held it back. Now to the rest of his policies. The Civil War was much more costly, in both human and economic costs, than any prior war in U.S. history, and thus led to massive changes in the U.S. economy. To fund the war, Lincoln approved the first income tax in U.S. history. Before this, most of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs. Tariffs make goods more expensive, affecting the poor and businesses who spend most of their money on goods, and thus they hurt the economy, although they do help domestic producers because consumers will shift to buying from them rather than foreign producers. Progressive income taxes are preferable, as they hurt the economy much less by taking money from the rich rather than the poor and businesses. The top income tax bracket was made 5% in 1862 and 10% in 1864, and it affected people making over $10,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that would be around $150,000 a year today. This would only be the top 10% today, and was even fewer people back then, as the median salary was lower, even adjusted for inflation. The poorest workers paid no income taxes, while the middle class paid 5% instead of 10%. But this wasn't nearly enough to fund the war, and rather than further increase the income tax, which was only being introduced for the first time, Lincoln also increased tariffs, and even did some money printing, which introduced fiat currency to the US for the first time. This still didn't balance the budget, and the debt to GDP ratio shot up from 1.6% to 29.5% between 1862 and 1866. The money printing led to inflation rates of 11, 22, and 22% in 1862, 63, and 64, as the money supply increased a ton. But printing stopped after the war ended and inflation subsided. In fact, there was even a long period of deflation after the war, with prices halving between 1865 and 1898, but we'll cover that later. Outside of these necessary evils to fund the war, Lincoln's economic policies were very positive for the economy and country. The law for printing fiat currency also regulated state banks to make monetary policy more consistent, made notes the same nationwide, establishing a national currency for the first time, and gave the ability to sell bonds to fund the government. Lincoln also signed 2 acts Buchanan had vetoed that improved the economy in the long term. The first was the Morrill Land Grant College Act. It gave federal support in public lands to establish new colleges to teach engineering and agriculture. Prior to this, colleges were private and catered to the elite, teaching law and philosophy to rich people that spoke Latin. This act made education more accessible and relevant without subsidizing Ivy League schools or their graduates. There are 106 land-grant colleges in the US, including the entire UC system and many other large public schools like Texas A&M and UIUC. It did include a few private schools like Cornell and MIT, which are Ivy League and Ivy League adjacent, but Cornell administers public colleges and MIT remains committed to engineering. Later versions of this act established HBCUs like North Carolina A&T and Tuskegee University. In the coming decades, the US became a world power in engineering and agriculture thanks to its educated population because of this bill. The GI Bill after World War II similarly helped the US massively. Lincoln also signed the Homestead Act, which helped people establish family farms west of the Mississippi by making land cheap or free. This act had been vetoed by Buchanan because it didn't allow slave owners to claim land. Without this, states like Idaho and the Dakotas wouldn't have been settled for a lot longer, and it helped poor people find new opportunities in these areas and develop the country. There was also the Pacific Railroad Act. As mentioned under Pierce, a transcontinental railroad had started development. The southern route was better as it avoided the Rockies, but obviously it couldn't be built during the Civil War, and most of the work that had been done by 1860 was only in the Midwest portion of the route. Lincoln then approved a new route that avoided the South, instead going through Utah to Sacramento. It was completed in 1869 and, along with the Homestead Act, facilitated Western settlements. Less credit for this than those other two laws, as previous administrations had also supported railroads, but it was still a good idea. This and the Homestead Act both led to further conflicts with the natives as whites moved west, but these mostly happened under later presidents as the Federal Army was too busy with the Civil War to fight natives under Lincoln. The economy grew by 10% in 1862 and 63 with the war ramping up, then modestly in 64 and 65 before a minor post-war recession in 66. But I mentioned a lot of the benefits from these acts were long-term benefits. Thus, I give Lincoln a very good grade on his economic performance. He also created the Department of Agriculture. Modern agricultural policy is pretty horrible due to laws and subsidies since the New Deal, but creating the department was still a good decision. But there were some more questionable things Lincoln did when running the war. First, there was the suspension of habeas corpus for suspected Confederate sympathizers. They could be jailed without trial after the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1863. This law was much more reasonable than other wartime measures that violated the First Amendment. Most wars are against foreign countries, and laws like the Alien, Sedition, and Espionage Acts criminalize criticism of the government or anti-draft activities. They're still in use today to go after legitimate journalists who point out U.S. war crimes. The horrible Supreme Court case Schenck v. United States allowed these laws, despite the First Amendment. But this war was literally with other Americans, and there certainly were Confederate sympathizers in the border states, so it was reasonable, and it's definitely not comparable to those acts or things like Japanese internment. What I will harshly rebuke Lincoln for is implementing a draft for the first time in U.S. history. Rich people paid to dodge service, so the law was quite classist. Poor Irish and German immigrants held racist attitudes, didn't care about preserving the Union, and didn't want free blacks moving north to compete with them for jobs. In New York City, which had a lot of these immigrants, anti-draft sentiment escalated into the draft riots of 1863. Mobs attacked and lynched over 100 black people. After this, black people started leaving Manhattan to go to Harlem and Brooklyn. Obviously, the riot was wrong, but so is the draft. It's essentially state-sanctioned slavery, forcing people to fight and die in wars. It's sexist as it only affects men. It's classist as the rich can pay to avoid it while the poor go die. And it doesn't even make sense to win a war, since you should only want the most fit people and those willing to serve to be in the army. If you want more soldiers, increase pay or improve conditions for them. People are usually happy to help out the war effort in other ways, like conserving food and power, or working in factories to produce war materials, but a draft has a ton of flaws, and Lincoln loses points for approving one. Finally, let's move on to foreign policy. No European countries recognized the Confederacy, and despite continuing trade with them after the war started, none of them denounced the Union's blockade of the South, although there was some blockade running to try to avoid it. Europe continued to trade with the Union to receive food, and managed to find alternative sources for cotton like they had during the War of 1812. France did try to take advantage of the US's preoccupation by invading Mexico and asking for a ceasefire so they could trade with both sides. The US didn't directly help Mexico until after the Civil War ended, as they needed resources for their own war, but Lincoln opposed France's actions. Brazil, which had also not yet abolished slavery, was an ally of the Confederacy and did supply them with weapons. But overall, the Union made sure few other countries helped the Confederates. The Emancipation Proclamation especially did so, as prior to that, the arguments the Confederacy made for independence were much like the ones the US had made against Britain during the Revolutionary War, wanting more autonomy and the ability to dictate their own trade by reducing tariffs. But the proclamation made it clear that the US no longer tolerated slavery, and as most countries besides Brazil had already abolished it, they then sided with the Union, ensuring the blockades would be respected and the Confederacy defeated, except for France. Overall, Lincoln is a little bit overrated. We don't give nearly enough credit to the so-called radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and others were better than Lincoln on Reconstruction, as we saw with the Wade-Davis bill, and will see with them pushing the 14th and 15th Amendment and civil rights legislation during Andrew Johnson's presidency. Grant as president also did a ton for black people by using the army to take on the KKK. Lincoln's flaws of being weak on Reconstruction and implementing a draft are often overlooked, and he lacks longevity as he really only had one term. But his economic policy is probably underrated, and his foreign policy was really solid too. And at the end of the day, he was still infinitely better than all of his predecessors when it came to the issue of slavery. Even if the rest of his party was also there, he was still incredible relative to era, especially if you compare him to the two presidents who preceded him. and thus he gets massive credit for freeing the slaves. So he makes S, but I can't put him above either person already in S, so he ends up third so far. Now to his successor's tenure. Lincoln's second term ended abruptly as he was assassinated on April 14, 1865. His VP, Andrew Johnson, succeeded him. As mentioned, the Republicans' poor showing in the 1862 midterms made Lincoln choose the Unity ticket when running for re-election in 1864 to reach out to the Unionist vote. Johnson stayed in the Senate after Tennessee seceded, and Lincoln named him military governor of Tennessee once the Union controlled it. Johnson made sure the Emancipation Proclamation did not affect Tennessee. It only applied to areas currently in rebellion, so Tennessee, which was now controlled, would not count. But he freed his own slaves in August 1863, so Lincoln viewed Johnson as loyal enough to be named his VP, and vice presidents don't generally have much power anyway. For most of 1864, Lincoln actually thought he would lose his re-election bid. Even with the battles going better post-Gettysburg, the Union still lost plenty of soldiers, taxes were raised further in 1864, and resistance like the New York City draft riots indicated dissatisfaction with his tenure. The Democratic nominee was George McClellan, who had been a general before Lincoln fired him, if you remember from the Civil War timeline. Unlike some Democrats, McClellan promised to finish the war, but he still rejected Republican policies on abolition and running of the war. He likely still won all the Peace Democrat votes, as his VP and platform called for an immediate end to the war. But a string of military successes, including the capture of Atlanta late in 1864, helped carry Lincoln and Johnson to victory. They won 55% of the vote, which doesn't sound like much, but it was the most anyone had won since Andrew Jackson in 1828. They only lost 2 slave states and McClellan's home state of New Jersey. Democrats did almost win New York, which is part of why the popular vote was so close, and the House popular vote was also only 53.5% Republican, 42% Democrat, and 4.5% Unionist or other. But Republicans landslided the House as well. The overall environment was just much more favorable than 2 years prior, so they gained seats almost everywhere. And in the 1866 midterms, Republicans increased their margin. Voters sided with the Republican Congress and the legacy of Lincoln much more than with Johnson and the Democrats, and the pattern of the president's party getting clobbered continued. Unionists became Republicans, and Republicans won all but 2 of the readmitted Southern seats, as freedmen voted while ex-Confederates often couldn't. Republicans then had 77% of the House and 86% of the Senate after these midterms. Johnson attempted to run for re-election as a Democrat, but lost in the primary. I'll cover what the Democrats and Republicans stood for after the Civil War in Grant's slides. Now to Johnson's term. Immediately after he took office, Johnson had a honeymoon period. The death of Lincoln led to a lot of sympathy, and that day, assassins were also sent after Johnson and the Secretary of State, though only Lincoln died. In May, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was captured and the Civil War officially ended. It was believed that even if he wouldn't support pro-black policies, Johnson would at least be hard on the rich plantation owners in the South, as he had grown up poor, although as I mentioned, he eventually became a slave owner himself. But as soon as the process of Reconstruction began, Congress broke from him. As we saw, Lincoln was not perfect on Reconstruction. He vetoed the Wade-Davis bill and his 10% plan was very weak, but he supported proposals like the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau, and was moving in the right direction on voting rights. Johnson was way worse. He also accepted the 13th Amendment, but was abysmal beyond that. His plan to readmit states was even more lax than Lincoln's 10% plan. While Lincoln had at least disenfranchised the highest-ranking Confederates, Johnson began pardoning them and made it so confiscated land was returned, thus undoing Sherman's reparations and preventing the Freedmen's Bureau from doing something similar. Lincoln put pro-Reconstruction Republicans in charge of the readmitted states, including the great Nathaniel P. Banks, who you remember was voted Speaker of the House as a Know-Nothing in 1854, in Louisiana. But Johnson put ex-Confederates back in charge of the states. These people, who wished slavery could still be legal, tried their hardest to reinstate it by another name. Every readmitted state but North Carolina passed black codes. These restricted things like black literacy, gun, and land ownership, limited the kind of work black people could do or what contracts they could sign in order to force them back onto plantations, and used fake crimes like vagrancy, gaming, or doing something after sunset to convict black people of crimes and force them to do prison labor, as allowed by the 13th Amendment's except as a punishment for crime clause. Other methods for economic exploitation included debt peonage and sharecropping. Very few freedmen knew how to read, so many of them signed contracts that forced them to work on the plantations they had just been slaves on. Jim Crow laws were also passed to okay segregation or restrict voting rights. Johnson did nothing about any of this, stating white men alone must manage the South. He began withdrawing federal troops from the South, leading to several instances of violence against freedmen in places like Memphis and New Orleans. Enraged, the massive Republican majority in Congress took charge of the Reconstruction process. They passed a bill to extend the charter of the Freedmen's Bureau and a civil rights bill similar to the 14th Amendment. Johnson vetoed these bills, but Congress passed them over with his veto. They also started the process of passing the 14th and 15th Amendments to codify rights so future racist governments couldn't undo them and ensure previous laws in Supreme Court cases were explicitly overruled. The 14th Amendment is very long and complicated. Its first clause grants birthright citizenship, equal protection, and due process, and ensures states incorporate the Constitution. The citizenship part made sure the Dred Scott decision stating blacks couldn't be citizens was overruled. Equal protection made it so no laws could be explicitly racist, but in the future, laws were either implicitly racist, like with grandfather clauses, which I'll talk about soon, or race neutral, but enforced in a racist way, like our criminal justice system. The due process portion has led to the controversial idea of substantive due process. One of Roger Taney's argument in the Dred Scott decision was that freeing slaves once they went to the North violated the due process of the slave owner. Though, of course, defenders of substantive due process argued the slave had no due process when they became one, and that the Dred Scott decision was wrongly decided for myriad reasons. Substantive due process was also used to justify the freedom of contract between two parties to agree to anything that would be mutually beneficial. The Supreme Court used this to invalidate things like minimum wage laws during the Lochner era between 1907 and 1937. Nowadays, some argue it gives the right to bodily autonomy to have abortions. Read the amendment yourself and decide if you see anything in it that would guarantee the right to slavery, or an abortion, or ban minimum wage laws. I personally don't think the substantive due process interpretation makes any sense. The incorporation portion means states can't violate amendments and has recently mattered with gun control laws being invalidated. The second clause, I told you this amendment was long, that was just the first of 5 clauses, says states that deny some citizens voting rights will have fewer House seats as punishment. But it was never used, as states avoided explicitly racist voting laws, making it difficult to prove. The third clause says anyone who rebels against the government cannot hold office. This clause obviously applies to ex-Confederates, and should also apply to anyone who took part in the January 6th insurrection. But the attempt to apply to Trump didn't make it through Congress, and local lawsuits against other individuals have mostly failed. The fourth clause says Confederate debt will not be honored. This also comes up in this debt ceiling discussion where some people are saying that the debt ceiling shouldn't exist, but the amendment specifically says authorized by law, so it still means that Congress would need to pass a law to raise the debt ceiling. The fifth clause says Congress shall have the power to enforce this by appropriate legislation, which is in many amendments. The 15th Amendment is simpler, stating the right to vote cannot be abridged due to someone's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That last part was not already covered by the 14th Amendment, as like I said, it's a way to be racist without explicitly saying black people can't vote. Even after these were ratified, southern states still found creative ways to be racist. They made voting criteria include a literacy test, property requirement, or poll tax, but then allowed whites disenfranchised by these laws to vote if their grandfather could, hence the name Grandfather Clause. The Supreme Court said the 15th Amendment did not make grandfather clauses illegal in 1898 before changing their mind in 1915. Literacy tests and poll taxes were legal until LBJ and just enforced in racist ways. So even though these amendments were great, they still weren't enough to enshrine equality under the law. Johnson opposed the amendments, further proving he deserves a terrible score on equality. But while Lincoln had to convince Congress to pass the 13th Amendment, they were now more committed to Reconstruction than ever. The midterms affirmed Congress's mandate to continue Reconstruction and showed that voters did not approve of Johnson's racism. Congress also made Nebraska a state and gave black men in D.C. the right to vote, both over vetoes. But the ratification process for amendments also involves state legislatures, and obviously, southern states did not like these amendments. So for the 13th Amendment, Lincoln required southern states to ratify it to be readmitted to the Union. The amendment became law in late 1865. Johnson then tried to readmit the state governments and allow racist southern whites to return to power. But Congress is in charge of admitting states, so they ruled that Johnson's readmissions were invalid. They passed the Reconstruction Act, of course over Johnson's veto, which divided the South into 5 military districts and sent troops there, forming the U.S.'s largest peacetime army. They forced the states to include universal male suffrage in their constitutions, have racially inclusive elections with ex-Confederate leaders disenfranchised, and ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments before readmission. These amendments were ratified in 1868 and 1870, respectively. Some southern states voted in the 1868 election, but you'll see most of them only voted in 1872. But Johnson still tried to interfere with this process. As commander-in-chief, he had power over the military, and thus tried to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and continue removing troops from the South. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, stating the president needed the Senate's approval to fire cabinet members. Johnson tried to fire Stanton anyway. Stanton stayed in office, and Congress then attempted to impeach Johnson for intentionally violating the law, but failed by 1 vote in the Senate, as 7 Republicans voted no. The law was probably unconstitutional, so Johnson should have been able to fire Stanton, but why he wanted to makes this episode a negative for his grade. He was trying to fire Stanton just to be racist. Overall, he was a complete disaster and gets an F-, on his equality policies. And like I said during Lincoln's summary, we need to give more credit to these congressional Republicans for how they did so much over vetoes. Until the 1874 House elections, America was on a path to legal equality 90 years earlier, thanks to the efforts of Grant and congressional Republicans post-Lincoln. Now to Johnson's other policies. On the economy, the government had to deal with a large national debt and money supply caused by the war. Congress approved of contracting the money supply. Fiat money was slowly taken out of circulation, leading to deflation of 6% a year from 1866 to 1871. Deflation makes money more valuable, so it hurts those in debt. The debt to GDP ratio thus grew from 18% to 33% from 1865 to 1867, and deflation also hurt farmers who took out loans to buy land and needed a good harvest to pay back the loans. Keep that farmer point in mind when we cover the deflation in more detail with the Panic of 1873 soon. There was also a brief post-war recession, but the economy recovered after it, growing 2.8% on average from 1867 to 1870. Johnson did sign some laws on the economy. One was the Revenue Act of 1867, which halved the top marginal income tax rate to 5%. The debt to GDP ratio remained at 33% from 1867 to 1870, before a couple years of larger growth cut it down, although like I mentioned, the Panic of 1873 would lead to it increasing again. With the war over, expenses were much lower, so the higher rates were not needed to balance the budget, but it's not like cutting taxes on the ultra-rich helped the economy, so this was still a negative. Another was the Southern Homestead Act, but as expected, Johnson administered it in a racist way, not giving land to freedmen. The South also needed to move beyond cotton, as Europe had imported more from places like India and Egypt while the South was blockaded. Johnson didn't help this process as Lincoln had with his establishment of colleges, and thus the South remained poor. Overall, not much action on the economy, and it had strong growth from 1871 to 1873 after minor growth under him, and the deflation problems that led to the Panic of 1873 were largely caused by him, so another negative. But on foreign policy, Johnson was legitimately quite good. France had invaded Mexico during the Civil War and established a puppet government. Johnson sent troops to the border, armed Mexican rebels against the French regime, and asked France to leave nicely. They did, and this was a successful application of the Monroe Doctrine and a fight against European colonialism. Johnson also bought Alaska, as Russia feared losing it in a war with British Canada. Without the eventual discovery of oil, this move may not have been profitable, but that doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do, and this showed Johnson could negotiate a treaty and compromise, so I view this move as a minor positive. Johnson also tried to claim damages from Britain because Britain had sold warships to the Confederacy, but the claim reached the Senate towards the end of his term at the point where they despised him, so it would only be fully ratified during Grant's term. But Johnson still had the right position on that issue. Overall, he's a clear positive on foreign policy, and that drags him out of F- for me. Yes, he was abysmal on Reconstruction, got along incredibly poorly with Congress, including nearly getting impeached, and was bad on the economy. But when I compare him to Pierce, who's also an F, Johnson was worse on the economy, but not that much worse, while being much better on foreign policy and comparable on slavery/Reconstruction. So he goes an F alongside Pierce and above Buchanan. The next president was Republican Ulysses S. Grant, who was the main commander of the Union Army at the end of the Civil War. He hadn't held political office yet, but his strong support of Reconstruction earned him support from radical Republicans, and his military past gave him some appeal to more moderate voters. He faced a Democratic Party trying to define itself post-Civil War. In 1868, his opponent was Horatio Seymour, the former governor of New York, who ran on a white supremacist platform. Grant won most southern states where freedmen voted and ex-Confederates were disenfranchised, and swept the North, losing only New York and New Jersey, where Seymour had home court and Republicans were unpopular, and Oregon. His losses in the upper South states of Maryland and Delaware showed that the white supremacist platform still had appeal in these states which had only just ended slavery, and the popular vote margin was much closer. Since Democrats won New York and kept Republican wins in large states like Pennsylvania close, and in southern states where blacks couldn't vote, Dems won in a landslide, the popular vote margin was only 5%. In the House, Republicans retained a majority, but much smaller than 2 years prior, and in the 1870 midterms, they lost 34 more seats. More black voters were disenfranchised in the South, and in the North, Democrats moderated and ran against Grant's corruption scandals. Still, Republicans retained a majority, and thanks to strong economic growth, they won convincingly in 1872. In the House, they went from 56% of the seats to 68, and Grant won by 11.8% in the popular vote, the biggest win since Monroe ran uncontested. He actually faced liberal Republican Horace Greeley as opposed to a Democrat. I'll cover what liberal Republican means next slide when discussing the third party system. Democrats hoped Greeley would hold the base while winning some Republican support. But he had been an outspoken anti-slavery activist who denounced the Democratic Party, so Democratic turnout fell, while Grant held the base and won with ease. Some southern states had contested results, as Democrats tried to disenfranchise black voters. This didn't matter since Grant won easily, but the same issue would occur 4 years later in a much tighter race. It's also worth noting that the 3/5 compromise no longer applied to southern blacks, so the 1870 census gave southern states a lot more political power, even though those freedmen still couldn't vote. So compared to before the Civil War, the South now had more political power, even though it was still only the whites expressing it. If you're wondering why the map looks so weird, Greeley died before the Electoral College met, so his votes dispersed among many people. Everything was going swimmingly for Grant and the Republicans, but in the 1874 midterms, their 14 years of dominance in Washington ended. The economy crashed in the Panic of 1873, and more corruption scandals were revealed in the administration. Northern Democrats continued to moderate, attracting liberal Republicans to their side, while Democrats also gained in the South as more black people lost the right to vote. 94 House seats flipped, which at 30% of the total number of seats was the second largest swing in US history and gave the Democrats a majority. Let's now cover the third-party system in more detail and learn what the two parties stood for from the Civil War until the next realigning election in 1896. The third-party system of the Republicans and Democrats was established after the 1856 presidential election, when Republicans outperformed the Whig Know-Nothing fusion ticket and became the main opposition to the Democrats. These two parties have been the two largest ever since, but their ideologies have changed drastically, so this party system just covers their beliefs from 1856 to 1896. From 1856 to 1876, the Republicans were defined by Abraham Lincoln and radical Republicans such as Charles Sumner. The party was founded in opposition to slavery, and Lincoln helped pass the 13th Amendment to abolish it. After his assassination, congressional Republicans led the opposition to Andrew Johnson and moved further towards racial equality with the 14th and 15th Amendments and military Reconstruction. Grant then used the army against white supremacist groups such as the KKK. But the 1876 presidential election had disputed results in southern states where black voters were intimidated and prevented from voting. Congress had to choose which results to certify, but with a Republican Senate and Democratic House, the Compromise of 1877 was agreed upon to make both sides happy. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was given the presidency, but in return, federal troops were removed from the South. Southern Democrats were then free to discriminate against blacks without federal intervention, and thus, Republicans stopped strongly pushing for more black rights. Democrats had two wings on racial policy during this period. The northern wing of Stephen Douglas was okay with restrictions on slavery, though they didn't argue for its abolition, while the southern wing of people like John C. Breckinridge wanted it legal everywhere. In the election of 1860, the Democrats split over this issue, and both Douglas and Breckinridge ran for president. After the election, war Democrats like Douglas supported the Civil War, even if they criticized specific policies like the draft or wartime inflation. But there were also peace Democrats in the North, and obviously Southern Democrats wanted the war to end and for slavery to continue. The 1864, 66, and 68 elections, along with the end of the Civil War, showed Northern Democrats that running on racism was not a recipe for success. From 1870 onwards, they moved on and focused on economic issues and corruption in the Grant administration. No Southern Democrat would be nominated for president after the split until LBJ in 1964. This change in strategy, or maybe even change in opinion, is known as the New Departure. But in the South, Democrats continued to be racist, targeting blacks with Jim Crow, black codes, or penal labor. Blacks in the South voted Republican when they could, but after Republicans mostly abandoned civil rights due to the Compromise of 1877, neither party did much for them for over 50 years. After 1868, and especially after 1876, other issues separated the two parties. Most Republicans had been Whigs, so they favored Whig economic policies such as tariffs and investment in infrastructure. And the Civil War led to a larger military and a larger government overall. In order to fund the war, Republicans increased tariffs and passed an income tax. They also invested in colleges with the Morrill Act and in the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, many Democrats like President Pierce supported the railroad. They were the party of manifest destiny, and it made going west easier, so policies like that and the Homestead Act had support from both parties, though the Homestead Act didn't pass earlier because of disagreements over slavery. But after the Panic of 1873, Democrats blamed Republican economic policies, and thus became the party of less government intervention. They also argued against things like the Enforcement Act, which gave the military the power to go after the KKK in the South. This was a policy where Northern Democrats enabled their Southern counterparts. They couched their arguments as being against a big government and military, not as being racist, but they were certainly still more racist than Republicans at that point. In 1872, the Democrats endorsed the liberal Republican candidate for president instead of running their own. Liberal Republicans were anti-slavery, but for civil service reform, against strong presidential power, and for states' rights. They had opposed Johnson's use of presidential power before Grant, and Grant's corruption scandals made civil service reform more salient. Many liberal Republicans became Democrats in 1874, as Northern Democrats continued to soften their stance on racial issues, and this, along with the Panic of 1873, led to the landslide of the House. Civil service reform would also be a key issue in the 1882 House elections. For the rest of this party system, the Democrats were the party of small government, while Republicans favored larger government. But this wing of Democrats, known as the Bourbon Democrats, received the blame for the next panic in 1893. After that, Democrats became the Progressive Party, leading to the Fourth Party System in 1896. Foreign policy was not very eventful in this period, with the next large war coming in 1898, but Democrats were against the annexation of Hawaii, while Republicans carried it out. Both parties largely supported the gold standard, which led to deflation over this period. From 1866 to 1899, prices net halved, inflation was only over 1% once, and this contributed to the panics of 1873 and 1893. After the Panic of 1893, Democrats were no longer in favor of the gold standard. The parties were also both for building railroads while being anti-Chinese immigration, causing immigration to the US to remain predominantly white and Christian until the 1960s, and anti-Native, with the Wounded Knee Massacre, one of the last large conflicts with natives, occurring in 1890. Though Democrats were slightly better on the issue, as I noted, they tended to be slightly against a larger military. In terms of bases of support, the Democrats dominated the South from 1878 until 1948, while the Republicans dominated the Northeast and tended to win the West and Midwest as well. New York was the tipping point state in the 1880, 84, and 88 elections, but Democrats won it and lost the presidency in 1868 and 1876. Democratic struggles in Union states besides New York during this period are why they only elected 2 presidents between 1860 and 1932. There were 2 third parties that had an impact in this era, one of which I'll cover next slide, and the other with the 1892 election. Let's now go over Grant's tenure, starting with the Panic of 1873 and his response.
To understand how the panic came about, let's first talk about the decisions that led to deflation in the post-Civil War era and also partially caused the panic. I'll also cover the Greenback Party, founded in 1874, which advocated for a different monetary policy and first gained prominence in the 1878 House elections. It later merged into the Populists, which had presidential success in 1892. In fact, the 1892 Populist candidate, James Weaver, was the Greenback nominee in 1880. As you can see from the data, deflation was still an issue in 1892, and the Panic of 1893 was similar to the one in 1873. But there had been massive inflation during the Civil War, with printing of new fiat money and deficit spending that increased the money supply. So how did deflation come about in the next years? Well, when there is inflation, people who have borrowed money benefit. The value of the money they have to repay decreases, so they have an easier time paying back their loans. For example, if you give out a loan at 5% interest, but inflation is 10%, then you effectively lose money because you have what's called a negative real interest rate. You would be better off buying something than selling it for a 10% profit than giving out a loan for 5% profit. So big banks were not happy with the inflation during the Civil War. They wanted to stop the printing of fiat currency and only have gold-backed currency used to stop inflation, and that's what happened starting in 1865 with the Contraction Act. Lincoln's first Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, who the bank is named after, started the printing of greenbacks, the nickname for bills not backed by gold. But after he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his successor, Hugh McCulloch, started reducing the money supply. The Funding Act of 1866 and Coinage Act of 1873 continued the contraction of the money supply and led to deflation. Now, deflation isn't always a bad thing. Right now we have high inflation, and that's certainly an issue too. Policymakers thus try to keep inflation at a sweet spot around 2%. Deflation just means goods get cheaper, and that was also due to improvements in technology, farming, and transportation during this period. People like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller got massively wealthy, but they did improve people's lives by providing cheap steel and fuel, and more railroads were built, making transportation much cheaper for both internal and foreign trade. But deflation still hurt many people who weren't rich bankers. Farmers took loans to buy their land and equipment and needed crop prices to remain high to pay their loans back. Deflation made the loans have higher real interest rates. The greenbacks and populists were thus very popular with farmers in western states, as we'll see in the 1892 presidential election. They were also popular with silver miners who wanted to sell silver to the government and thus oppose the gold standard. Another contributing factor to the panic was the overbuilding of railroads. Rail companies saw a lot of investment and returned equity in their companies. But leading up to the panic, there had been too much investment and eventually the bubble burst. In September 1873, J. Cook & Company, a bank which owned the Northern Pacific Railway, went bankrupt. Many other banks soon followed, and stocks crashed. The economy had grown by 8.4% in 1872 and 8.5% in 1873, but the panic cut it to 1.8% in 1874 and negative 0.2% in 1875. Republicans were eviscerated in the midterms as a result. What did Grant do in response to the panic? Well, he continued the deflation that made these debts even harder to pay off and made the crashing of the bubble more severe. The Coinage Act of 1873 ended bimetallism, making it so only gold can be converted into currency and not silver, further constraining the money supply. And when Congress passed a bill in 1874 to inject money into the economy, Grant vetoed it, siding with the banking interests who liked the tighter money supply. He did let his Treasury Secretary print $26 million in greenbacks and later signed a compromise bill, but in January 1875, with the economy still doing poorly, he signed the Specie Payment Resumption Act, which resumed contraction and deflation. Prices and profits continued to drop, and soon companies had to start lowering their wages, starting the deflationary spiral, or lay off workers. The unemployment rate increased to 8.3%, which isn't that high when you compare it to something like the Great Depression, but the poverty rate likely increased a lot more with the pay cuts. Workers began striking for better wages, and we'll see how Hayes, Grant's successor, handled the strikes. Their anger also showed at the ballot box. In 1874, Republicans saw massive losses. Then in 1878, with the economy still mediocre and both major parties okay with deflation, the Greenbacks had a strong showing, winning 13 House seats. The economy did well from 1879 to 1881, but the deflation persisted throughout the rest of the century, culminating in a very similar panic in 1893. And like I mentioned, the Greenbacks had a lot of presidential success in 1892, and they would be pivotal in the direction the Democratic Party took in the new party system starting in 1896. Grant gets a poor grade on monetary policy. Like Andrew Jackson before him, who caused the Panic of 1837, Grant was a general and didn't know what was best on monetary policy, deferring to the advice of rich bankers instead of helping the people. Now let's move on to the rest of Grant's term. The best parts of Grant's terms were his actions on Reconstruction. Firstly, the 15th Amendment was ratified during Grant's tenure. Texas, Virginia, and Mississippi couldn't participate in the 1868 election because they hadn't yet ratified it. Grant strongly supported it, and it became law in 1870. He also signed the Naturalization Act, which ensured that freedmen were citizens, retroactively applying the citizenship clause added in the 14th Amendment. More important than signing laws was Grant's enforcement of them. He created the Department of Justice and used it and the Army to prosecute the first iteration of the KKK. He signed the Enforcement Acts, which increased penalties for anyone obstructing another person's right to vote and made it easier for the government to go after the KKK by speeding up the legal process to prosecute them. Thousands of white supremacists were arrested, and there was a massive decrease in violence against freedmen as a result. The KKK was almost entirely wiped out and only regained prominence after the film The Birth of a Nation was released in 1915. Other white supremacist groups like the White League and Red Shirts were also prosecuted. Freed blacks voted in the 1872 election, and thus Republicans had success in the South. But white supremacist Southerners did not give up. After the election in Louisiana, Democrats attempted to ignore the results and install their candidate into office. Grant used federal troops to ensure the Republican governor was seated despite resistance from the White League. But after Inauguration Day, black Republicans were murdered outside of a courthouse in Colfax, in an event known as the Colfax Massacre. Similar events happened in other areas, such as Arkansas, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Again, Grant tried his hardest to prevent these events and prosecute the perpetrators, but after the loss of the House in 1874, it was made more difficult, and the Supreme Court also made racist decisions. In the U.S. v. Cruikshank case, they let the perpetrators of the Colfax Massacre go free, and in the slaughterhouse cases, they ruled the 14th Amendment only applied to federal citizenship, not state citizenship. After the 1876 presidential election was contested, Grant did not intervene, instead letting a commission be formed which led to the aforementioned outcome of Hayes being given the presidency, but troops being removed from the South permanently. So despite Grant's best efforts, the 1874 and 76 elections ended Reconstruction for good. His last attempt to enshrine equality into law was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which passed in February during the lame duck session before Democrats took control of the House. It guaranteed equality for blacks in places like jury selection and public transportation, but was ruled unconstitutional in 1883, with the Supreme Court again siding against equality. Even though Grant gets an S+ on Reconstruction, state-sanctioned racism still continued until the 1960s. He did sign the Amnesty Act, which removed voting disqualifications for most ex-Confederates, but it passed 38-2 in the Senate, so veto wouldn't have done anything, and it won't dock him for signing it. On foreign policy, Grant was generally more successful at enacting his agenda than with Reconstruction. The US did not get embroiled in any wars and had good relations with most countries. For example, as mentioned under Johnson, Britain had sold warships to the Confederacy which had damaged Union vessels, and the US's claims reached a resolution during Grant's term, with the US getting some compensation in the Treaty of Washington of 1871. Grant also named one of the first black officials to the US government, with James Turner becoming the envoy to Liberia. During his tenure, the US settled a conflict between the Liberian government and a local tribe known as the Grebo, and made it so the Liberians gave citizenship to the Grebo and access to trade in exchange for the fighting ending. So it was a fair settlement and not the US showing favoritism for their former colony. The US reached a free trade treaty with Hawaii without supporting coups or US business interests as would happen later in the century, and began contact with Korea as they had with Japan under Fillmore. And when Cuba started a war for independence from Spain, the US did not support either side, claiming full neutrality. All of this was great, avoiding conflict with other countries and coming to agreements that benefited both sides. There was one major time Grant did not get what he wanted in foreign policy, the proposed annexation of Santo Domingo, now called the Dominican Republic. Unlike past presidents who wanted more slave states, Grant wanted to annex it for good reasons. He knew that blacks in the South were being treated poorly, but instead of shipping them off to Liberia and not caring about what happened afterwards, he wanted Santo Domingo to be a proper state and treat blacks fairly there, which would force white Southerners in other countries like Brazil that still had slavery to start treating them better. It would also help U.S. interests by being a shipping hub, providing natural resources, and increasing influence in the region. So the idea had merit. But Charles Sumner, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, led the opposition to the treaty and made sure it failed. He did not want to interfere in the region because of conflict between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and thought it was too expensive to assume more debts in the annexation treaty. Sumner was a radical Republican, so it's not like he opposed the treaty for racist reasons. There were decent arguments on both sides. The Senate vote in 1870 was 28-28, with all Democrats opposing it as it meant black citizens, while Sumner and other Republicans voted no as well. A two-thirds majority is needed to ratify a treaty, so it failed. Grant continued his pursuit of annexation, getting Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist and civil rights activist, to endorse it, and he also persuaded senators to remove Sumner from his positions of power in the Senate. But the annexation never succeeded, and Sumner then turned against Grant, opposing his re-election bid and endorsing the Liberal Republican ticket instead. The other main reason Liberal Republicans defected was corruption scandals during Grant's tenure. Now, I don't think Grant is to blame for most of these. Firstly, there is evidence of him stopping some of them. For example, after the US decided to restart the gold standard, some financial speculators began hoarding gold to drive up the price, and then tried to reach out to Grant's sister, who was married to one of them, to gain information and make money. But Grant allowed more gold to be sold in order to reduce the price and make them lose money. And he created the Civil Service Commission in 1871, before many of the scandals, in order to ensure that federal employees were at least qualified for the jobs they took, although even that would not be enough to stop all corruption. Congress failed to renew the commission in 1874, and civil service reform remained a major issue for the next decade. But when there's so much smoke, there's probably some fire, and all these scandals at least prove that Grant didn't research and ensure that his cabinet ministers weren't corrupt ahead of time. The most famous of these scandals were the whiskey ring and credit mobilier scandals, though the latter began during the prior presidencies when the railroad started being built, which is another reason why I don't give too much blame to Grant. But there were also many smaller ones, such as the Indian, Star Route, and Trader Post rings, the Sanborn incident, Department of Interior scandals, and more. Had Grant been stronger on this issue, I'm sure there would have been fewer scandals, but I have to give him some credit for taking actions to stop. There are also many smaller issues that occurred during Grant's tenure. On Native Americans, he had a very mixed record. He definitely wasn't actively for conflicts with natives, as he spoke out against events like the Marias Massacre, tried to find a diplomatic solution before the Great Sioux War broke out, and preferred assimilation of genocide. But conflicts continued to happen as more Americans moved west and railroads were built, and he clearly did not actively care enough about the issue to make sure conflicts did not occur. He signed the Comstock Act, which made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, or lascivious, immoral, or indecent publications through the mail. Like how Andrew Jackson restricted abolitionist mail, this is blatantly unconstitutional and counts against him. Though, of course, it's not as bad as what Jackson did, given that was a pro-slavery action. And like other progressives of that time, he was supportive of women's rights, giving them better wages and the ability to sue and have property separate from their husbands. He also started the national park system, making Yellowstone protected land and protecting wildlife such as buffalo. He was also a strong supporter of separation of church and state, advocating for the Blaine Amendment, which would ban public money from going to religious organizations such as schools, but this failed in the Senate before even making it to the states. So overall, Grant was actually better than Lincoln on racial issues and also great on foreign policy. But his mistakes on monetary policy, with decades of continued deflation in the Panic of 1873, as well as the numerous corruption scandals, which I have to give him some blame for, even if not all of it, definitely hurt. He's too good to be in B, as his positives are better than those of anyone not in S, but his mistakes knock him out of S, making him the first occupant of A so far. As mentioned, the 1876 presidential election was extremely close and contentious. Democratic Governor of New York Samuel Tilden won the popular vote by 3%, racking up massive margins in southern states that disenfranchised blacks, while winning New York and holding Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to less than 51% in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, the next three largest states. But only the Electoral College matters, and the Compromise of 1877 gave the contested states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina to Hayes, giving him a one-vote victory. To get Democrats on board with the compromise, federal troops were removed from the South, so the 14th and 15th Amendments began being violated, making blacks unable to vote in the South until the 1960s. Democrats then dominated presidential elections there until Strom Thurmond ran third party in 1948. In the House, Republicans only had 2 seats in ex-Confederate states in 1879, and the number stayed around there for a long time. But in the country as a whole, Republicans did well in the House in the 1876 and 78 elections. Democrats had a strong majority after the 1874 landslide, but in 1876, Republicans recovered 33 seats, though they stayed the minority. In 1878, Hayes then broke the streak of midterm massacres. The Greenbacks, listed here as the Nationals, won 13 seats, taking more from Democrats than Republicans. They became the main opposition to Democrats in the South and won some seats in the Midwest, while Republicans remained dominant in New England and gained back seats from Democrats in places like New York and Pennsylvania. Hayes took a pledge to not run for re-election after the compromise, but Republicans won the presidency and House in 1880. They even won back the Senate and controlled it until 1892 after the Democrats briefly won the Senate in 1878. So voters certainly liked Republicans during and after Hayes' tenure. But was that deserved? Let's find out. On civil rights, Hayes was hamstrung by the Compromise of 1877. He was forced to withdraw troops from Louisiana and South Carolina, allowing ex-Confederates to lead their governments. But in other areas, he tried to continue the fight for equality. He vetoed laws that would repeal the KKK and enforcement acts from Grant's presidency and tried to pass civil rights laws. But no more laws were passed, the Supreme Court rolled back older laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and state governments continued disenfranchising and discriminating against blacks. So Hayes fought a losing battle. And while Hayes was not allowed to deploy federal troops to the South to protect black rights, he did use troops in the North against railroad strikes. After deflation and the Panic of 1873 hurt rail companies, they were losing money and had to cut wages. But while deflation had been about 15% between 1873 and 1877, average wages were often cut by up to 25%.
Rail workers across the country, from Chicago and Pittsburgh to West Virginia and Baltimore, took collective action to ask for better pay and working conditions. Some cities, including Baltimore and Pittsburgh, broke into riots, and Hayes sent federal troops to stop them. This was an action taken to help the companies instead of the workers, so a bad decision by Hayes. But these were legitimate riots that the army responded to, no federal troops killed any strikers, and Hayes made sure the governors requested the troops and didn't send them unprompted. Congress then passed the Posse Comitatus Act in 1878, which ensured that the army could not be deployed in such situations, and left the National Guard to fulfill that role if requested by a state's governor. In addition to preventing the president from crushing strikes, this also formalized the Compromise of 1877 and led to the era of the Jim Crow South. It was a move towards more states' rights and less federal government power. The most recent time this law was relevant was during the George Floyd protests, when Trump was unable to deploy the army to stop either peaceful protests or riots. But again, while Hayes shouldn't have used the army, it's not like they violently cracked down on the strike, and you'll see a later president be much worse on this issue, so I'll only give him a minor penalty for this. Hayes also met congressional opposition when it came to the issue of civil service reform. Both parties had political machines to hand out jobs to party members as political favors, rather than to the most qualified. For example, in New York, Boss Tweed ran the Democratic machine in Tammany Hall, while Republicans, including future President Chester A. Arthur, controlled the Customs House. So parts of both parties opposed Hayes' efforts for civil service reform. Reform only passed in 1883, after Hayes' term, but Hayes pushed strongly for it, asking for funding for the U.S. Civil Service Commission or examination laws. And without his push for it, it's unlikely that the law would have passed in 1883. In lieu of a strong law during his presidency, Hayes fought against corruption in other ways. Once Democrats won the Senate during the 1878 midterms, Hayes forced Arthur and other New York Republicans from their positions that they obtained via corruption and appointed qualified Republicans to those positions. He also fired people involved in some of the post office corruption scandals that happened under Grant. So Hayes absolutely cared about good governance and treated it as more important than partisan politics and gets a lot of credit, even if he couldn't pass the reform law during his term. Compare that to today, when a small-town mayor is our Secretary of Transportation, despite having no qualifications, and thus we've had massive airline cancellations after receiving government bailouts, and rail workers being overworked and being denied sick leave, leading to train derailments. That's not to mention the campaign finance corruption in general in our current system. Hayes was also fantastic on the economy. He appointed John Sherman, who later wrote the Sherman Antitrust Act, as his Secretary of the Treasury. They grew the economy by an average of 8.1% from 1877 to 1881, up from 3.9% over the previous decade, while also keeping average deflation under 1%. Congress did override Hayes' veto of the Allison Bland Act, which allowed the minting of silver coins to increase the money supply, so perhaps he was saved from a mistake. But in the end, Hayes and Sherman found the right balance to get the economy growing and keep deflation at a fine amount. The debt-to-GDP ratio also fell from 25% in 1877 to 18% in 1881, despite Hayes increasing pension benefits for Civil War veterans. That move was popular in the North but very unpopular in the South. It benefited Republicans electorally since they were losing the South regardless. It was definitely a politically savvy move, even if it wasn't the most economically sound one, and I'm not a huge fan of it. Still, Hayes clearly managed the economy very well. Finally, to foreign and native policy. Chinese immigration had been abundant in order to staff railroad companies in the prior years, and many native-born workers blame immigrants for cutting their wages. This of course is true, as when the supply of workers increases, wages go down. But the opposition was very racist, with riots occurring in cities like San Francisco that had large Chinese populations. Hayes vetoed the 15-passenger bill that would have restricted Chinese immigration, thus maintaining good foreign relations with China and not buying into racist rhetoric. And unlike later presidents, Hayes did not interfere in Panama. France attempted to build a canal there, but it would entail supporting the Panamanian independence movement against Colombia. Hayes asserted the Monroe Doctrine and rejected French interference in the region, and the plan to build a canal failed terribly. Hayes also maintained good relations with Mexico under Porfirio Diaz and helped settle a conflict between Argentina and Paraguay. So a great foreign policy. But his native policy was not as great. Natives continued to lose lands in conflicts with the army, such as in the Nez Perce War. In the Great Sioux War under Grant, Grant was willing to pay for the land, allowable under eminent domain, and the Sioux refused, only to lose it in battle. To this day, the Sioux have still refused to collect the payment for the land. But most of the conflicts under Hayes was the army siding with white settlers who encroached on native land, or the U.S. supporting Christian missionaries in native lands, a blatant violation of separation of church and state. Hayes did support assimilation more than war, but often the assimilation was done at gunpoint or also involved giving up land. So he's definitely a negative on native policy. Still, Hayes overall had a decent presidency. He's not good enough to make B, as the Compromise of 1877 limited his civil rights efforts, and he did authorize army action against strikes and natives. But he was great on foreign policy, had strong economic management, and Republicans had the best midterm by an incumbent party since 1838 under him, then won the presidency in Congress after his tenure finished, showing that the voters clearly thought he was a good president. So I'll put Hayes in C+. With Hayes not running for re-election, the next Republican nominee for president was James Garfield, a congressman from Ohio. He defeated Democratic nominee Winfield Scott Hancock, who had been a general during the Mexican-American and Civil Wars. With strong economic growth from 1879 to 1881 and the Panic of 1873 officially over, Republicans also won both houses of Congress from the Democrats. The Greenbacks lost a few seats, although they won 3.35% of the presidential vote, up from only 1% 4 years prior, with a more popular James C. Weaver as their nominee. Most of this support was in rural states like Iowa and Kansas, or in southern states where Republicans had very little support, such as Texas and Mississippi. Hancock won every former slave state, beginning the Democratic domination of the Jim Crow South, but otherwise flopped, winning only California, Nevada, and New Jersey. New York was the tipping point state, and Garfield won it by 1.9%, much more than Weaver's 1.1% there. The fact that Garfield's VP, Chester A. Arthur, was from New York likely helped. And as you can tell from this slide, we're going to be discussing Arthur and not Garfield. Why? Well, Garfield was assassinated less than a year into his term by Charles Guiteau, a man who supported machine politics and was mad that he had not been given a government job. Garfield was strongly against corruption, and Arthur had been chosen as his VP to balance the ticket and placate the corrupt wing of the party. But this issue caused massive Republican losses in the midterm elections, resuming the trend of the incumbent party losing. Democrats gained 68 seats while Republicans lost 34, with the new census adding seats. Republicans were seen as being the party of corruption and faced the consequences. Arthur did change his mind and support civil service reform, but it was too late. Arthur did not run for re-election due to health problems, and he would die in 1886, just 2 years after his term finished. Now to evaluate his presidency. I'll start with the most important part of Arthur's tenure, civil service reform. Arthur did support the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which passed in the lame duck session in 1883, after Republicans saw they had been thrashed in the midterms for being against reform. But I don't think it's so simple to say that Garfield's murder changed his mind and that he deserves a claim for supporting the act. Most of Garfield's cabinet members resigned after Arthur became president, and Arthur replaced them with fellow stalwarts, or supporters of the corrupt patronage system. And he nominated his old boss and leader of the stalwarts, Roscoe Conkling, for the Supreme Court. Conkling was confirmed in a 39-12 vote, though he declined the position. Arthur was still good buddies with the stalwart wing of the party, so I don't think he really favored civil service reform that much. But in his defense, once the act passed, he implemented it effectively, making it so customs service and postal jobs were decided by merit. He was good on this issue in 1883 and 84 after being poor on it in the year and a half prior, so I'll give him minor credit, but certainly not a major positive given his appointments of his fellow corrupt friends in his administration. The other major issue during Arthur's term was the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. While Hayes vetoed the 15-passenger bill, Arthur signed an act that banned Chinese immigration for 10 years and restricted access to citizenship for many Chinese who had already immigrated to the US, although he did veto an earlier version of the law that banned it for 20 years instead. This fed into racism and worsened relations with China, and was certainly a terrible move. Before this point, almost all immigrants to the US were accepted and welcome. But from this point until the 1960s, immigration decreased massively from places outside of Western Europe, often with terrible consequences, including the denial of some Jewish refugees during the 1930s and 40s. More restrictions were in the Immigration Act of 1882, which Arthur also signed. That law had the phrase, "Any person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge shall not be permitted to land," which is quite open-ended and was certainly implemented in biased ways. And Arthur also signed the contract labor law, which further reduced immigration of laborers. In addition, he did nothing to stop Jim Crow. The Supreme Court ruled in 1883 that the 1875 Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional, but Arthur didn't try to pass any legislation to replace it, and did nothing after the Danville Massacre in 1883, which targeted black voters before the Virginia gubernatorial election to help Democrats. So Arthur was definitely more racist than his Republican predecessors, a large stain on his legacy. On the economy, Arthur had a fairly unimpressive record. After growth of 8.1% under Hayes and a reduction of 7% in the debt-to-GDP ratio, growth only averaged 1.7% under Arthur, and the debt-to-GDP ratio only fell by 1.2%. There weren't many new laws passed during his tenure. One was the Mongrel Tariff Act, which passed in the lame duck in 1883, and kept higher tariffs, which Republicans favored. Arthur allegedly wanted larger reductions, but didn't pursue them further later in his term, even though Democrats now had control of the House. Another was the 1882 Rivers and Harbors Act, which passed over his veto. He thought the money spent in the bill was too concentrated in specific regions, which is a reasonable critique, but with the poor economic performance during this period, and especially compared to under Hayes, Arthur loses points on the economy. And to finish up on his tenure, he did try to improve relations and increase trade with Latin America, and was average relative to era Native Americans, siding with whites who settled on or near native land, but not supporting wars and favoring the allotment system and assimilation via funding for schooling for Native children. Overall, Arthur was a slight positive on civil service reform, but he had a clear negative with his racial policy, and nothing else was that great either. Still, although the Exclusion Act was bad, it's not as bad as a pointless war or depression. His lack of major mistakes let him escape D, but as a clear below average president, he lands in C-. Next up is Grover Cleveland, the only Democratic president during the 50-year stretch between the Civil War and 1912 when Woodrow Wilson was elected. He's also the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, as he lost re-election in 1888, but then won again 4 years later. Trump is trying to do the same, and we'll see if he can replicate Cleveland's success. I'll cover Cleveland's 2 terms separately and give a combined grade at the end, since I think it's best we discuss events chronologically. In 1884, he defeated James Blaine, who had been Secretary of State under Garfield and supported the secular Blaine Amendment referenced under Grant. The election was incredibly close. Cleveland swept the South, as all Democrats during this period did, and won the tipping point state of New York by 0.1%, or just 1,149 votes. Blaine won most of the Midwest and New England. Cleveland was governor of New York during the election, and he was known for his efforts against corruption by both parties' machines in the state. This issue strongly resonated after Arthur's presidency, and the home field advantage helped Cleveland in New York as well. Republicans gained House seats during the 1884 election, though this was just a mild recovery after the 1882 midterm slaughter. But Democrats then had a mediocre midterm, losing 15 seats, and then lost 15 more and the majority in 1888 as Cleveland lost his re-election bid, which I'll cover on the Harrison slide. Now let's evaluate his first 4 years. Cleveland was an advocate for small government, and that showed up in many decisions during his presidency. In my view, the worst decision he made based on these principles was the veto of the Texas Seed Bill in 1887. There had been a terrible drought, and farmers lost many of their cattle and crops. Congress tried to give seeds to help them recover and have better harvests in future years. But Cleveland disagreed, writing, "I believe that a donation of seed to the farmers in this region would avert continuance of an unfortunate blight, and yet I feel obliged to withhold my approval of the plan, as proposed by this bill, to indulge a benevolent and charitable settlement through the appropriation of public funds. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation of the Constitution, and I do not believe that the duty of the government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government." Okay, fine. You think federal aid leads to dependence and people not working hard. But even if you think that, which I already disagree with, a massive drought was not the fault of these farmers. It's not like they all got lazy and the crops failed. It was a temporary natural disaster. A one-time relief payment does not cause dependence on the government. You can criticize the Farm Bill we pass every 5 years because that does give subsidies, encourage dependence, warp the market, and make Americans unhealthier. But a one-time relief payment after a drought that even Cleveland thought would help the farmers become productive again is the wrong thing to veto. So this was definitely a bad decision. On the issue of regulating railroads to stop them from making trusts and hurting consumers, Cleveland's small government views were for the worse. He signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which created a commission to look into the railroads, but did not strongly implement it. And when we get to his second term, we'll see more proof that he certainly sided more with bosses than with workers or consumers. Cleveland also vetoed many bills to try to increase pensions to Civil War veterans. This was a political issue that Southerners opposed and Northerners liked, and Cleveland sided with the Southerners due to his small government beliefs. This time, I think he made the right decision, as these bills were more about gaining votes than helping the economy. Cleveland was also great on civil service reform, just as he had been as the governor of New York, making more government jobs subject to the Pendleton Act. Another area in which his small government views were for the better was the issue of tariffs. Tariffs were still high from when they had been raised during the Civil War, and at this point the debt-to-GDP ratio was down to 15%, so Cleveland wanted to reduce them to help lower prices for consumers. Republicans were still mostly in favor of tariffs to help northern manufacturers, while Southerners wanted cheaper goods and lower tariffs the other way for their exports. Because Republicans controlled the Senate until 1892, no tariff reduction passed during Cleveland's first term, but it would in his second term. There was also still the issue of deflation and the gold standard versus silver coinage. Cleveland kept the status quo of limited silver coinage, and his economic policy led to pretty good results. Growth averaged 6.7% from 1886 to 1890, and deflation was a manageable 1.2% over the same period. Cleveland was also for small government in his foreign policy. He refused imperialist impulses in the Congo, Hawaii, and Samoa, not interfering or making pacts to split the land with European powers, but letting the locals rule themselves. He also maintained good relations with Canada and came to a deal on fishing rights. So Cleveland was certainly a positive in foreign policy. But he was racist when it came to immigration, signing the Scott Act, which prevented Chinese immigrants who left the US from returning, and extending the immigration ban, which originally only lasted for 10 years. Finally, when it came to natives, he was the best of his era. He stopped white settlers from entering native land in the Dakotas, an issue where Arthur was in the wrong and had encouraged the white settlers. He also signed the Dawes Act, which gave lands to individual native families rather than the local governments, thus enabling them to set up businesses or farm the land. J.J. McCullough has a great video about how rights for governments often end up hurting the individuals within those societies. Search 6 classes of the Canadian citizen and you'll find it. Natives were also given U.S. citizenship by this act, and thus were given protection from laws such as the Bill of Rights. It even gave the land to natives not currently living on reservation, and led to the Dawes Rules, which listed all natives and thus prevented whites from lying about their ancestry to claim land for themselves. No Elizabeth Warrens allowed here. The law gave 160 acres per person to natives, which is a massive number, and some of the remaining land was then sold to whites, with the proceeds then going towards education and assimilation of the natives. That was the one bad part of this act, as it meant schools that got the money forced assimilation on native children and tried to take away their culture.
People also criticized the act for allowing natives to sell land, and then show that their total property decreased in the years following it. I view that as an incredibly paternalistic and racist criticism. If natives wanted to sell the land, that was their decision. Land was not taken away by the US Army via force or the threat of force in coerced treaties like what happened during most other presidents of this period. And another criticism comes from the fact that much of the remaining unapportioned land was held in trust and thus cannot be developed by natives. But this loss of the trust would expire after 25 years, so any land still being held in trust today is because of later administrations, not Cleveland. Overall, even if you criticize this act, Cleveland was still far better than other presidents of his era on natives by not fighting wars with them. That's it for Cleveland's first term. I'll now move on to Harrison and give Cleveland's full grade after his second term. In 1888, Cleveland faced Republican Benjamin Harrison, grandson of the 9th president, William Henry Harrison. The first Harrison's term was only 1 month, so he didn't get a grade. Harrison ran in favor of tariffs and Civil War pensions, which, as mentioned, Cleveland opposed. These policies were popular in the North, and even though Cleveland expanded his popular vote margin from 4 years prior, he lost key support in the tipping point state of New York, which he lost by 1.1%. He also lost Indiana, Harrison's home state, compared to 1884, while all other states stayed the same. Republicans also picked up 27 House seats, giving Harrison both branches of Congress for the first 2 years of his term. Democrats only lost 15, as new seats came from 7 newly admitted Big Sky states early in Harrison's term. But Harrison and the Republicans faced a brutal defeat in the 1890 midterms. The economy had mediocre growth, and Republicans raised tariffs, increasing costs, but they also increased the debt with new spending, causing them to be lampooned as the billion-dollar Congress. Republicans already had very few southern seats, and lost half their northern seats in the midterms. The Populist Party, which as mentioned was the successor to the Greenbacks, had a good showing in Kansas and Nebraska, and took votes from Republicans as it appealed to progressive voters, but opposed a high tariff. Republicans slightly recovered their numbers in the 1892 House elections, which also added seats from the census, but Harrison lost re-election quite soundly, and Democrats also took control of the Senate in 1892. But as we'll see, the 1894 midterms then swung Congress back the other way and led to the next party system starting in 1896. Now to Harrison's tenure. The most important accomplishment of Harrison's administration was the Sherman Antitrust Act. Written by John Sherman, who you'll recall was Hayes' Treasury Secretary, the bill gave the DOJ the power to go after businesses who created monopolies in order to artificially raise prices and hurt consumers. Two of the most notable sectors that had trust during this time were steel and oil, where Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller controlled monopolies. Harrison also enforced the Interstate Commerce Act much more than Cleveland did. He also signed the Land Revision Act of 1891, which protected public lands, most of which were forests. Teddy Roosevelt receives a lot of credit for his work in antitrust and conservation, and he did take them further, but Harrison preceded him. Harrison also continued the fight for civil service reform, further increasing the number of positions subject to the Pendleton Act, and even appointing Teddy himself to the Civil Service Commission. He also attempted to pass civil rights legislation, as the Supreme Court had overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act in 1883. The Federal Elections Bill, written by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, who would gain more fame for his opposition to Woodrow Wilson, would have federal officials inspect elections, which are otherwise run by the states, to ensure that they were being conducted fairly. But despite passing in the House and being strongly supported by Harrison, it was filibustered and failed to pass the Senate. It didn't help that some corrupt Republicans opposed the bill as they didn't want their own elections to be overseen. Harrison also supported the Blair Education Bill, which would give federal funding for schools to students of all races. Some Southern whites supported this as white literacy was also poor, but the bill failed as not all Republicans voted for it. Thus, Jim Crow laws still stayed in place despite Harrison's best efforts. Now to some negatives of his tenure. The issue that voters punished Republicans the most for was tariffs. Congress passed the McKinley tariff, named after the future president who authored the bill in the House. It further raised rates to discourage imports and help domestic businesses. Secretary of State James Blaine, who was busy trying to expand trade with other countries, knew that if the U.S. increased tariffs, then other countries would tax U.S. goods, and U.S. exports would thus decrease. He negotiated to get reciprocity provisions in the bill, which allowed the U.S. to cut import tariffs on countries that didn't tax U.S. exports. Still, the bill raised effective rates to their highest point since the so-called Tariff of Abomination 60 years prior. McKinley would even lose re-election to the House in the midterms. How he became the Republican president later, I don't understand. I give Harrison a negative on tariffs, but not a large one, as he was better than most members in his party given the reciprocity provisions. But economic performance in general was mediocre during Harrison's term. Growth averaged 4.7%, worse than Cleveland and Hayes but better than Arthur. And since the Panic of 1893 occurred right after Harrison left office, this 4.7% mark is actually quite generous. Another mistake was expanding pensions with the Dependent and Disability Pension Act, something Cleveland had opposed. Again, this was just a political move to benefit Republican voters and didn't make much economic sense. The deficit grew, and voters who had to pay more for goods but didn't get any pensions back were angry, leading to the midterm massacre. Harrison did sign the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which finally ended the decades of deflation dating back to 1866. Inflation was positive from 1891 to 1893, and after 2 years of deflation caused by the Panic of 1893 and Cleveland's repeal of this act, deflation then didn't cross 1% for 30 years.
Now, some economists actually claim this contributed to the Panic of 1893, but I'll defend this bill when we cover the Panic more in depth in 2 slides. However, on Native policy, Harrison definitely deserves criticism. The Wounded Knee Massacre took place in late 1890, and Harrison sent the troops there and gave them medals afterwards. He also took land from natives in Oklahoma. It was known as Indian Territory at the time and unaffected by the Dawes Act. Harrison opened the area to white settlers, and 50,000 moved in and claimed land with no compensation to natives. This is why he gave Cleveland such good marks on natives. Yes, he supported assimilation in schools, but he was still way better than the rest of his era. On foreign policy, Harrison was quite imperialist. While he did establish good relations and reciprocity treaties with some countries, he had bad relations with Chile. During the Chilean Civil War, the US supported the incumbent government, who was eventually defeated. Getting involved in other countries was not the intent of the Monroe Doctrine. The intent was that Europe not get involved either. Then, when US soldiers there got punished for their role in a bar fight, Harrison got mad, demanding reparations while threatening to sever diplomatic relations with the new regime. Chile eventually acquiesced to the demands. Harrison also got involved in Hawaii, supporting a coup of the Queen which would benefit US fruit and sugar companies. In fact, the first president of the new government was Sanford Dole, whose cousin established the Dole Food Company that still exists to this day. The US recognized the new government, and Harrison attempted to annex Hawaii, but the bill stalled in the Senate during the lame duck session of 1893, and Harrison left office before he could sign it. He obviously still gets blamed for supporting the coup and is thus a negative on foreign policy. Overall, Harrison gets a C for his presidency. His good stances on regulation, civil rights, reciprocity, and monetary policy cancel out his bad stances on tariffs, pensions, natives, and imperialism, making him a very average president. Now we're back to Grover Cleveland's second term. Cleveland easily defeated Harrison in the 1892 election. He was able to retake New York and Indiana, which he had won in 1884, and even won Illinois and Wisconsin. The third party, the Populists, had a strong showing as well. James Lee Weaver had won 3.3% of the vote in 1880 with the Greenback Party, and now won 8.5% under the label Populist. Like the Greenbacks, Populists were for free silver and ending deflation in order to help farmers who took out loans. They were also for many progressive policies, such as postal banking, a progressive income tax, direct election of senators, and nationalization of the railroads. But they were also against tariffs, making the Republican Party, which was otherwise more progressive than the conservative Cleveland Democrats, not a great fit. Populists had little success in the Northeast, where both major parties had long histories and voters tended to be wealthier, but they came second in some states in the Deep South, and had the most success west of Missouri, winning 4 states where farmers made up most of the population. They won 11 House seats in 1892 and got up to 22 in 1896. In the 1894 midterms, Democrats got absolutely obliterated. The Panic of 1893 hurt them. As while the causes date back to Harrison's term, the response by Cleveland and Congress was very poor. Democrats lost 125 seats, over half of their pre-election total, the worst result in any House election in U.S. history. Republicans won all but 1 seat in New England, 90% of New York, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest, and even made some inroads in southern seats. This led to the Cleveland wing of the Democratic Party being completely rejected, resulting in a political realignment and the fourth party system in 1896, which I'll cover under the next presidency. So let's see what Cleveland did that was so unpopular and led to this sea change. Let's discuss the causes of the Panic of 1893 before we get to Cleveland's response. Recall that the 1873 panic happened when there was deflation, making loans harder to pay back. Once the first rail company went bankrupt, others began to follow, and the bubble quickly burst. Then there were also bank runs, farmers went bankrupt, and the damage spread to the entire economy. The 1893 panic had a similar chain of events. The farmers who were settling into the newly admitted states had taken out loans, either mortgages to buy their land or loans for their equipment. But recall that after Harrison passed the Silver Purchase Act, deflation was over. So what was the cause of the 1893 panic? Similar to the one in 1819, it was caused by an oversupply of goods. The new improvements in railroads, steel, and other technologies had increased output more than the population of the US itself had increased. Additionally, like in 1819, which followed the Tambora eruption and years of bad harvests, 1893 was also after some years of drought, such as the ones in Texas leading up to the Texas Seed Bill. Weather improved and crop yields increased. What does a country do when it produces more than it consumes? It exports the extra goods. But due to the 1819 McKinley tariff, as well as increased production in other parts of the world, exporting the goods became more difficult. With the supply of goods far outstripping their demand, prices crashed. For example, wheat and corn prices halved in the first few years of the panic. And there were also other causes of the panic. Rail construction had peaked in 1887, but stocks had not yet come back to reality. In 1892, only 44% of rail shares returned dividends, a sign of things to come. In 1893, the rail bubble began to burst. This started with the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad going under in February, the National Coolidge in May, the Erie in July, and the Northern Pacific in October. And with the rail construction decreasing, steel and iron producers also had decreased demand, and soon the damage spread to all industries. Banks also began to fail. If you ever wondered why these events are called panics, it's because when the first bad news comes, sometimes people begin to withdraw their money from banks, and once the first person does that, panic sets in and we have a bank run. With this specific panic, the bank troubles were also influenced by foreign investors withdrawing their money after the Panic of 1890 in Europe, starting with the collapse of Baring & Brothers in November of that year. British investors then liquidated their holdings in New York City in order to bring the money back home. The panic only hit the US in 1893 after the other causes, but eventually hundreds of banks would close. Finally, I'll mention that the Sherman Silver Purchase Act gets blamed by many economists. The law minted paper money in exchange for silver coins, but this caused the federal government to be low on gold, as the paper money given out in exchange for silver could also be redeemed for gold. But a lot of the decrease in gold reserves was also due to foreign investors selling stock in return for gold, and I don't think the Silver Purchase Act was to blame. Simply temporarily suspending the gold standard and not allowing paper money to be redeemed for gold during the panic would have been a much better solution. But Cleveland was a strong advocate for the gold standard. This is why the new Western states so soundly rejected Cleveland in the 1892 election, instead becoming two-way races between Harrison and the populists. Also, the act arguably delayed the panic by stopping deflation, so I view it as a positive for Harrison. But remember, his increased tariffs and deficits that caused the panic made him a negative on fiscal policy. So what was Cleveland's response to the panic? Well, we already know he wasn't going to pass any stimulus or other measure to try to stop the bleeding, as he was ideologically committed to smaller government. Instead, he viewed the Silver Purchase Act as a big part of the problem and signed a repeal of the law. But this likely backfired. It caused silver prices to crash, so the mountain states with silver mines took a massive hit to their economy, and the deflationary spiral worsened. Like I mentioned, deflation was over leading up to the Panic of 1893, but this restarted it. To further ensure the gold reserves didn't run out, the Treasury printed large quantities of bonds and relied on rich bankers like JP Morgan to buy them. So this prevented the US Treasury from going bankrupt, but the working class was also suffering. Some went on a march to the US Capitol known as Coxey's Army. They asked for jobs programs or a stimulus and the return of the Silver Purchase Act to help miners and stop deflation. Not only did Cleveland not listen to their demands, but he also used the US Army to break up the march. Even worse was when he deployed troops across the nation to crush a strike of rail workers. Like in 1877, rail companies cut wages for their workers by more than the deflation rate. In 1894, the American Railway Union, led by many-time socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs, had 125,000 workers go on strike against the Pullman Company, which manufactured the rail cars. But as this affected federal mail delivery, Cleveland believed he had the authority to send the army to end the strike. He sent them to cities across the US without first getting approval from the governors of the states, which was required by the Posse Comitatus Act Hayes had signed. The Supreme Court would allow this in the case in re Debs, saying that because the strikes affected interstate commerce, the president could intervene. The army obliterated the strike, killing hundreds of workers, putting leaders such as Debs in jail, and causing the American Railway Union to dissolve. Obviously, this was an atrocious move by Cleveland, helping big business rather than workers who were suffering, and his handling of the strikes was much worse than what Hayes did, as the army became violent. The GDP fell by 5.8% in 1893, then 4.7% in 1894. With this poor economic record, the use of the army against strikes and marches, and no antitrust enforcement, regulation of banks, or stimulus for the people, it's no wonder the Democrats were wiped out in the 1894 midterms. Their philosophy was seen as elitist and failed, and the backlash was so severe that the next 25 years would be known as the Progressive Era, as voters wanted anything but this from their politicians. I agree with the voters and give Cleveland an abysmal rating on his response to the panic. While Cleveland's response to the panic was poor, he was good on some other economic issues. He was able to reduce tariffs, which increased prices for the working class, and passed an income tax on high earners to raise revenue instead. A progressive income tax is vastly preferable to tariffs, as it hurts the economy less and decreases income inequality, so this was a great move by Cleveland. Without an income tax, people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan had become insanely rich in the preceding years, which we now call the Gilded Age. The tariff reduction and income tax passed in 1894, and the economy grew by 11.4% in 1895. But the income tax was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1895, and was no longer in effect until the 16th Amendment passed in 1913. GDP fell by 1.6% in 1896. 1895 was much more likely to be a fluke good year for the economy than Cleveland's response actually making things better. On foreign policy, Cleveland was as good as in his first term. He withdrew the treaty for the annexation of Hawaii from the Senate, so the US did not take it over. But he couldn't undo the coup, so the oligarchy remained in place and Hawaii was annexed in 1898. It did have to wait 60 years for statehood because racists in Congress didn't want the many Asians there to be able to vote. Cleveland's stance was also correct on Cuba and Spain. Cuba declared independence from Spain in 1895. Cleveland didn't intervene, thus correctly applying the Monroe Doctrine. When we get to his successor's foreign policy, you'll see just how good Cleveland was in comparison. But when it came to civil rights for black people, Cleveland sucked. Firstly, unlike Harrison, Cleveland didn't care that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 had been ruled unconstitutional. As mentioned, that decision came in 1883, before Cleveland's first term started in 1885, but Cleveland didn't try to replace it in that term. But he was even worse during his second term. When campaigning for it, he opposed the law to federal elections bill Harrison newly passed, and during his tenure, he signed a repeal of the Enforcement Act which Grant had used to go after the KKK, and which Hayes refused to repeal. And when the Supreme Court gave their Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896, which said discrimination was okay and would later be overturned by Brown v. Board, he approved of it. So Cleveland was certainly terrible on black rights, even if he was good for Native Americans and minorities overseas by rejecting imperialism. Overall, I would give Cleveland's first term a C+, as the economy did decently, and he did good things for natives, which balanced out his few bad things such as the veto of the Texas Seed Bill. But in his second term, while he passed his desired policies on tariffs and the income tax, he was much worse with his crushing of strikes and racism against black people. So his second term would get a D, and overall, he comes out to a C-. Now let's learn about Cleveland's successor and the fourth party system that followed after the Democrats rejected his ideology. The next presidential election pitted Republican William McKinley from Ohio against Democrat William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska. McKinley was like the Republicans who came before him, just a little more right-wing. On economic policy, he was strongly pro-tariffs, writing the bill that had passed during Harrison's term, and was also pro-business like Arthur and Hayes had been. On foreign policy, he was imperialist like Harrison, but also anti-black, more like Arthur. But Bryan represented a large departure from the Democratic nominees before him. Since 1860, Democratic presidential candidates were either New York pro-business establishment figures or generals who tried to be above partisanship. Bryan, on the other hand, was a 35-year-old anti-establishment Western Democrat running on a message very similar to the Populist Party. He spoke out against the gold standard and for government intervention to help farmers and others hurt by the panic. The Populists had success in the West on this platform in 1892, and it also strongly resonated in the South, where voters were poorer than in the Northeast and also mostly farmers. Since Northern Democrats were nearly extinct after the 1894 midterms, they only made up 28% of the delegates at the 1896 Democratic Convention, so Bryan won the nomination. He was also endorsed by the Populist Party, which is why they didn't run a candidate in this election, despite having done so well in the previous one. But while he was popular with that demographic, he also caused the Democratic Party to lose support from big business. McKinley capitalized, endorsing a gold standard and raising campaign contributions from wealthy contributors. And in general, Northeastern voters who worked in manufacturing or finance were not huge fans of Bryan's pro-farmer policies. So McKinley won every Northeastern and Midwestern state, while Bryan took the South and the West. And not only did McKinley win the Northeast, he dominated. Harrison lost the popular vote in 1888 while winning the presidency, as he only won New York by 1% and Pennsylvania by 8%, while losing by 20% in the Deep South. But McKinley won New York by 19% and Pennsylvania by 25%, so he won the popular vote by 4.3%, despite only a mild improvement in the Midwest and a worse performance in the South and West. Despite his loss, Bryan was renominated in 1900, and he lost again with a similar map. He won Kentucky, but lost some Western states. McKinley chose Teddy Roosevelt as his VP to replace his first-term choice, who died in office, and that helped in the West. Foreign policy also played a bigger role, as the Spanish-American War had happened, and this allowed Bryan to regain some support from pro-business, anti-intervention Democrats. But McKinley still won with an increased margin in the popular and electoral votes thanks to the strong economy and success of the war. However, he was assassinated 6 months into his second term by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, so Teddy became president. In the 1896 House elections, Democrats recovered 31 seats compared to 1894, but still had less than after any other election since 1872. However, there were also 22 Populists elected, and they began becoming Democrats now that Bryan supporters had taken over the party from the conservative wing. 1898 was a typical midterm, with the incumbent party losing some seats. But Republicans lost way fewer than the 93 and 125 in the two prior midterms, so they kept a majority. And in 1900, they renewed their mandate, winning 13 more seats. Also, Republicans held the Senate from 1894 all the way until 1912. Now let's cover the fourth party system in more detail. At the end of the third party system, Democrats were the more conservative party, and the last Republican president, Benjamin Harrison, was somewhat progressive. But in 1896, Democrats did a complete 180 and became the Progressive Party. Bryan was nominated in 1896 and 1900, then again in 1908, and ever since, the Democrats have been the further left of the two major parties. And I mentioned McKinley was from the right wing of the Republican Party, and that wealthy donors started giving money to Republicans. Did they also do a complete 180 and become a conservative party? Well, not in 1896. McKinley's first vice president, Garrett Hobart, was also conservative, but Hobart died in 1899, so McKinley had to choose a second-term VP. Ironically, he chose Teddy not because he wanted to be more progressive, but because vice presidents don't really do much, and conservative New York Republicans didn't want Teddy to remain as governor. But after McKinley was assassinated, Teddy became president, and thus Republicans now had a progressive president. Now, with the Democrats, the House members were almost all progressive after 1896 because the conservative Democrats in the North were wiped out in 1894. But even though Republicans had a progressive president, they still had conservative members in Congress. Teddy failed to pass some parts of his agenda, but this became a bigger issue under his successor, William Howard Taft. Republicans had a terrible midterm in 1910, with Democrats winning the House for the first time since 1894. Teddy then decided to run for a third term in 1912 due to dissatisfaction with Taft's tenure. He ran third party after Taft won the Republican primary, but he only succeeded in splitting the vote. Progressive Republicans voted Teddy, and conservatives voted Taft. They won 27 and 23% of the vote respectively, so Democrat Woodrow Wilson won 435 electoral votes, over 80% of the total, with only 41.8% of the popular vote. Republicans nominated a moderate in 1916 to appeal to both wings, but he narrowly lost, and after Teddy died in 1919, the conservative Harding-Coolidge ticket won the presidency, and the party became conservative for good. So why do I say this party system ended in 1938? Well, before then, the parties were drastically different, and there were wild swings in the House. The 1912 election and the splitting of the Republican vote led to Democrats winning 291 seats, but then the backlash to Wilson in the end of his tenure led to Republicans winning 302, until the Great Depression caused Democrats to get up to 334 seats after the 1936 election, before FDR went too far and Republicans picked up 81 seats in the 1938 midterms. After 1938, there was a consensus between the two parties that the first New Deal was good, but the second one and things like court packing went too far. Republican presidential candidates from 1940 until 1980, except Barry Goldwater, were all somewhat moderate. But from 1920 to 1936, all the Republican candidates were very conservative, and they got destroyed in the 1932 and 36 presidential elections. And since 1938, no party has ever had 300 or more House seats, or gained over 80 seats in any one election. So I feel 1938 demarcates the fifth party system, although some historians will say it changed in 1932. Now let's get into the finer details of the beliefs each side had during this party system. On economic policy, Democrats were for higher income taxes and more government intervention, while Republicans thought tariffs were a better way to raise money and help domestic businesses, and opposed large government spending after 1912. On foreign policy, McKinley and Teddy were interventionist, but afterwards, Democrats became the more interventionist party. Wilson joined World War I and tried to join the League of Nations, but Republicans in Congress prevented the US from joining it. Then, after no wars under Republican presidents, FDR eventually joined World War II after Pearl Harbor, and his wife was instrumental in the creation of the United Nations, which was similar to the League of Nations. On racial policy, Republicans no longer argued strongly for black rights, but Democrats, including Woodrow Wilson, were explicitly racist and much worse on this issue, although under FDR, this began to change. Republicans were more in favor of prohibition, with Wilson vetoing the Volstead Act and FDR repealing it, while the Republicans in between them enforced it to varying degrees. Democrats in the South opposed giving women the right to vote, as they feared black people would soon be re-enfranchised as well, but Northern Democrats supported it more than Northern Republicans. As for the 17th Amendment, which made senators voted on by the people as opposed to state legislatures, it was supported by progressive Democrats and opposed by conservative Republicans. In terms of bases of support, Republicans still dominated the Northeast, which was richer and thus opposed income taxes and other government intervention, and the Midwest, though a little less so than the Northeast. The West was more Democratic than those two, but the South was by far the most blue. Because the Northeast and Midwest were more populated, this meant Republicans dominated this party system, only losing two elections between 1896 and 1932, one of which was caused by Teddy splitting the vote with his third party run, and the other one being incredibly close, while all of the Republican victories in this period were landslides. There was also another successful third-party run in 1924 by progressive Robert La Follette, as that year the Democrats also nominated a conservative and left the progressive lane open. Eugene Debs also perennially ran with the Socialist Party, but only once finished above 3.5% of the popular vote, never won any states, and never affected the outcome. In the House, third parties never had over 10 seats in any Congress after the Populists and Democrats merged, and that's still true today. Now to McKinley's presidency. The most important events during McKinley's tenure, and the biggest departure from previous presidents, were in the realm of foreign policy. Firstly, he annexed Hawaii. It was already controlled by a pro-annexation American businessman, so this was inevitable. The blame goes on Harrison for supporting the coup of the Queen, and I won't criticize McKinley for this. But he gets plenty of blame for the Spanish-American War. Cuba declared independence from Spain in 1895, and Cleveland did not get involved. But McKinley began negotiations with Spain, asking them to give some autonomy to Cuba. Spain partially acquiesced, and McKinley sent an American battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba to ensure Spain honored the concessions. The Maine then exploded. A naval commission blamed an underwater mine, even though that seemed less likely than an internal explosion, given that if it were an external explosion, fish would have been found dead in the surrounding waters. McKinley then signed a congressional resolution asking Spain to withdraw from the region and give Cuba full independence. Spain refused, the US blockaded Cuba, and both sides declared war.
Now, the original reason for the war was to give Cuba independence, and Congress overwhelmingly passed the Teller Amendment, which ensured the US would not establish permanent control of Cuba after the war. But once the war broke out, the US also sent forces to the Philippines to side with locals fighting against Spanish rule, restarting a conflict after both sides had agreed to a truce a year earlier. The Spanish were being attacked on multiple fronts by 3 different parties and lost the war within 4 months. The US sustained heavy losses, mostly due to diseases such as yellow fever against their ground troops, but they had a vastly superior navy and destroyed many Spanish ships in the battles of Manila Bay and Santiago. In the treaty to end the war, Spain ceded Cuba to the US, but also the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba was a protectorate until 1902, when it was given its independence as promised. The US kept Guantanamo Bay and would intervene in the country in the future, but McKinley was not responsible for those actions. But he did make terrible decisions in the other 3 territories. Guam and Puerto Rico have been part of the US ever since, and you can definitely criticize the US rule there, but worse was what happened in the Philippines. The US had just told the locals that they would help them defeat the Spanish imperialist rulers, but they then decided that they would be the imperialist rulers instead. Obviously, the Filipinos who wanted independence did not go quietly, and as a result, the Philippine-American War started. Like the later Vietnam War, this was largely fought in jungles with guerrilla warfare, and thus the US's superior technology didn't play as much of a role. And like with Vietnam, the US committed many atrocities against civilians, with scorched earth tactics and even concentration camps known as reconcentrados. But this war was even worse than Vietnam, as that was at least to help the South against the North. In this war, none of the natives wanted the US to rule over them, but the US refused to grant independence and fought the war anyway. An absolutely indefensible decision by McKinley. You can defend the Spanish-American War by saying that the US did give Cuba independence, and maybe Spain did fire at the Maine and they were responsible for starting the war, even if that evidence is iffy. But the Philippine-American War has no defense, and it was a terrible decision, leading to the pointless deaths of many American soldiers, Filipino soldiers, and civilians. The war ended in 1902 after McKinley was assassinated, and the US gradually gave sovereignty back before final independence in 1946. Another pointless war the US got involved in was the Boxer Rebellion. McKinley sent 5,000 troops to Beijing without congressional approval, joining an alliance with many European nations to protect Christian missionaries who lived in China. Originally, the Chinese government did not support the rebels, but after 8 countries sent troops inside China without approval, they also got fed up with colonialism and supported the rebels. But they were defeated, the invading armies demanded monetary compensation, and the weakened Chinese government was overthrown 10 years later by the nationalists, before the nationalists later fought the communists in the Chinese Civil War. Again, McKinley ignored any idea of territorial sovereignty and invaded a foreign country for fun. But he did have one good action in his foreign policy. After the war with Spain, it was clear that the long journey below South America was too inconvenient for US ships. Thus, McKinley began the process of building a canal through Central America. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty was signed, overriding a previous 1850 treaty with Britain that prevented either country from establishing a canal. McKinley promised that the canal would be open to all shipping to get Britain to agree. Now, when the canal later started being built, Teddy supported an independence movement in Panama against the Colombian government, intervening in another country's affairs so the canal could be built there. But McKinley wanted it to be in Nicaragua, so in this case, the bad foreign policy decision was not his fault. Still, he was clearly bad on foreign policy overall. Before his presidency, all the wars the US had fought were on US soil, but this started a trend of fighting offensive wars against countries that didn't attack us that has continued for over a century. Now to his domestic record. The Panic of 1893 fully ended by the time McKinley took office. As a result, the economy grew at an average of 6% during his tenure. McKinley's economic decisions weren't necessarily the reason for the good growth, but they didn't hurt the economy much either. Congress passed a large tariff increase known as the Dingley Tariff. This did help reduce the debt and pay for all of McKinley's wars, but it hurt poorer workers who now had to pay more for goods like sugar. But after the acquisitions, Puerto Rico, now a part of the US, increased its sugar production to compensate, so the law probably didn't hurt the economy too much. In addition, McKinley was a supporter of reciprocity treaties, which bring down tariffs when both countries agree, so overall, he was decent on this issue. He also strongly supported the gold standard, and the discovery of gold in the Yukon Territory of Canada and Alaska made it so the money supply increased without silver coinage. Inflation was positive throughout McKinley's tenure, and deflation didn't hit 1% until the Depression of 1921, so the gold standard ended up being fine for the economy. McKinley was not great on the issue of antitrust. He let the Attorney General bring suits against trust, but defended some of them and was not as vigorous as his 2 successors. But he was good on labor issues, signing the Erdman Act, which banned employers from not letting their employees join unions, and used the arbitration process to avoid strikes, but made sure unions were heard and received concessions. Overall, McKinley was a neutral on the economy, but on civil rights, he was far worse than the Republicans before him. While he was against lynchings, he reached out to racist Southern whites, visiting Confederate memorials when he toured the South, and he did nothing about Jim Crow laws or violence against blacks. One example was the Wilmington insurrection in North Carolina. The Republicans and Populists jointly ran against the Democrats and won the 1898 election, but Democrats led a violent coup and took control of government. This led to decades of Democratic rule and disenfranchisement of black voters. McKinley did nothing about this and allowed the white supremacist government to be established. But he was good on natives, signing the Curtis Act, which was written by a Native American, Charles Curtis, who would later be Herbert Hoover's vice president and held the highest political office by any non-white until Obama was elected president. This act extended the Dawes Act to the so-called 5 civilized tribes who now lived in Oklahoma, so it had the flaws and positives of the Dawes Act. It was mostly good, giving native citizenship, their own land and voting rights, instead of leaving all the power in the hands of unelected chiefs, but it did limit holdings to 160 acres per person and put money towards assimilationist education. Like the Dawes Act, I view it as a slight positive. It was written by a native who believed that assimilation and education were better than staying on reservations, so I think it would be incredibly paternalistic to call it a mistake. And it was certainly way better than what Harrison did with Oklahoma, which was allowing whites to settle in the area, taking away land from natives with no compensation. Additionally, after the Battle of Sugar Point with natives, McKinley pardoned everyone involved in the battle, and the frequency of conflicts continued to decrease. But he also reduced the number of government positions subject to civil service examinations, thus increasing corruption in government. Combine this with the fact that he received campaign contributions from big business, and he was the most corrupt president since at least Grant. So overall, McKinley was a very bad president, with a terrible foreign policy and slightly below average domestic record. But he was better than the people in F, so I'll put him in D. Teddy took over 6 months into McKinley's second term. Between his own popularity, a healthy economy, and sympathy for Republicans after the assassination, Republicans had a fairly successful midterm. The census added seats, and Democrats did gain more seats than Republicans, but it was still the best midterm by an incumbent party since 1878 and the second best since 1842. Teddy then demolished Democrat Alton B. Parker by 18.8% of the popular vote in the 1904 presidential election. Parker was a little-known judge who had never held elected office. He was supported by the business wing of the party, which temporarily retook control after Bryan's 2 straight losses. Parker supported a gold standard, causing Bryan and his supporters to eschew his campaign. Third parties thus received 6% of the vote in 1904, with Eugene Debs and the Socialists having their best performance yet at 3%. Parker won 0 states outside of the Deep South, and Republicans also gained 44 House seats. After this experiment, Bryan's wing returned to power in the party. Democrats did narrow the House considerably in 1906, but Teddy remained very popular. He then left on a hunting trip to Africa after his second term finished and endorsed Secretary of War William Howard Taft as his successor. But he returned, rebuked Taft, and ran for president again in the crazy election of 1912, which we'll cover soon. Teddy's tenure is best known for his progressive domestic policy. Like Harrison, who signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, he brought a lot of antitrust cases against big business. He created the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice and also created the Department of Commerce and Labor. The DOJ brought successful suits against rail, oil, and beef trusts. After his landslide re-election, Teddy wanted to expand the government's powers to prosecute monopolies, and Congress passed the Hepburn Act to empower the Interstate Commerce Commission that Cleveland created, but barely used. He also signed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the Food and Drug Administration. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle brought to light many unsanitary practices in the meat industry, and Teddy used the bully pulpit, a term he coined, to convince Congress to act. Other regulations passed during his term included child labor bans, maximum working hours, safety regulations, and workman's comp. Teddy also revived the issue of conservation. Grant and Harrison had created national parks and protected public lands, and Teddy continued their legacy. He believed the resources of the country should belong to its people, and should not be extracted by a private company to maximize profits, with no regard to what would happen to the environment. He designated more national parks, nature preserves, and federal land than all of his predecessors combined, and signed the Antiquities Act, which authorized the creation of national monuments. He also brought clean power to many western states with the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, which constructed federal dams and also irrigated farms throughout the region. Teddy was a significant positive in all of these areas. His policy helped all Americans instead of just the already rich. On labor policy, he was similar to McKinley, finding a great middle ground. He brought both sides to the negotiating table to try to preempt strikes with a deal they could both agree on. When business owners were too greedy, such as with the United Mine Workers strike, he allowed the strike to proceed, and the mine owners later acquiesced. Compare that to our current president who stuck the rail workers with a terrible deal and prevented them from striking. But Teddy also supported open shop laws, also known as right to work, for civil service employees. This meant public sector unions could not force workers to join them and pay money that could then be used to enrich the union bosses or on campaign contributions, something that was legal from 1977 to 2018 due to the Supreme Court changing its mind on the issue. Speaking of the Supreme Court, Teddy's tenure coincided with the conservative Lochner era, when the court struck down laws that regulated business based on the freedom of contract they believed was guaranteed by substantive due process and the 14th Amendment. I already made my disdain for this philosophy clear when we covered it under Johnson. The court used this to strike down some regulations passed under Teddy, such as working hours laws, which were overruled in the namesake case Lochner v. State of New York. On tariffs,
Teddy signed reciprocity agreements with Cuba and the Philippines, but did not try to reduce the overall rates during his tenure, thus avoiding the fights that plagued Taft. He moved left at the end of his tenure, proposing a federal income and inheritance tax, as well as other progressive proposals, like postal banking and an attempt to enhance the Sherman Antitrust Act, but these did not pass under him. Still, he did plenty of good on the aforementioned issues during his presidency, and gets a great grade on his economic policy. Now, the GDP growth under Teddy wasn't actually that great, averaging only 1.1% between 1903 and 1908, after averaging 6% under McKinley. But I won't count this against him. McKinley's numbers came during the recovery from the Panic of 1893, so the numbers were always going to look good. And at the end of Teddy's tenure, the economy was hit by the Panic of 1907, a brief stock market crash caused by Wall Street crooks who tried to manipulate the stock price of United Copper. But GDP increased by 7.2% in 1909, so the choice of years I gave definitely was arbitrary and hurt Teddy. And he certainly would have supported banking regulation that would have prevented the panic, though it was too late in his turn to pass any, so to blame him for the panic is ludicrous. The eventual regulation that passed was the Federal Reserve, which can pump money into the stock market when needed to prevent it from crashing. But it's controversial because it only protects Wall Street, and when these crashes happen, Congress and the President usually leave Main Street to suffer. When they pass a stimulus, it means trillion-dollar bailouts for businesses who are already rich and just crashed the economy, and a temporary tax credit or singular stimulus check nowhere near the same amount for everyone else. Knowing Teddy, he would support regulation of bankers that would be much better than the Fed. Now on to his other policies. On foreign policy, Teddy was similar to McKinley and Harrison. He believed the US should play an active role in world affairs, even if it meant intervening in other countries. At first, he honored the Teller Amendment and gave Cuba independence in 1902, but the incumbent party in Cuba rigged the 1905 election, so the opposition led a rebellion in 1906. Teddy intervened, sending troops to the region and placing American Charles Magoon as the provisional governor. Pre-elections were held under supervision of the US military in 1908, and after that the US did leave. So it's not like the US supported a coup or propped up a dictator, and I won't criticize Teddy for it. The Philippines was similar. The Philippine-American War came to an end in 1902 with the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo, though the US Army remained to continue fighting on some of the smaller islands the Spanish had never ruled over in a conflict known as the Moro Rebellion. But besides that, Teddy avoided violently ruling over the islands. Starting in 1907, Filipinos were allowed to vote for members in their own government, even if the US had the highest authority. And the US increased its trade with the region, as mentioned with the reciprocity treaties earlier, and improved the infrastructure and healthcare on the island. McKinley was responsible for the original intervention, while Teddy largely avoided conflict and gave the locals autonomy and improved their quality of life, so I won't blame him much here either. But when it came to Panama, Teddy was actually worse than McKinley. As I mentioned under Hayes, France had attempted to build a canal in Panama 30 years prior. Colombia controlled Panama, and the attempt was only done with limited support from them, so it failed miserably. McKinley had favored building a canal in Nicaragua instead, but that would have been longer than the one in Panama, so Teddy preferred finishing the Panamanian project. But after Colombia asked for more control over the canal zone, Teddy gave military aid to the Panamanian independence movement, recognized them as a country, and went ahead with the project. The Independence War wasn't nearly as brutal or long as the Philippine-American War, but this was still interfering in another country and supporting one side just because they sided with the US economic interest and gave the US more control over the canal than Colombia would have. The canal was completed in 1914 and has massively decreased shipping costs. Had Teddy just given Colombia more control over the canal without supporting the independence movement, it would certainly be in his positives, but I have to put it as a slight negative because it entailed US military intervention in a conflict we had nothing to do with. The US also got involved in other conflicts in the rest of the Americas known as the Banana Wars from Teddy to Woodrow Wilson. Troops were deployed to Honduras and the Dominican Republic, in addition to the countries I've already covered, during Teddy's tenure. He also increased US spending on the Army and Navy. But there were good parts of his foreign policy as well. He came up with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said European countries shouldn't use debt crises as excuses to violate sovereignty of any countries in the Americas, as the US would ensure the loans were repaid. This played out in Venezuela and the Dominican Republic. US troops were deployed to the Dominican Republic in 1904, but the two countries repaired their relationship, and in 1905, the US signed an agreement to temporarily control the customs house and fix the economy so the Dominicans did not default on their debt. The agreement was successful, with all parties, including the owners of the debt, satisfied with the resumption of payments and no military intervention involved. The US also mediated conflicts between other countries, with Teddy winning the Nobel Peace Prize for getting Japan and Russia to a peace conference during the Russo-Japanese War. Compare that to today, where the US is ensuring a war continues just to weaken a geopolitical adversary despite the damage it has done to the people on the ground as well as the global economy due to fuel and food shortages. Teddy also helped end a conflict in Morocco, kept good relations with Japan, ensured trade with China continued without sending troops, and rebuked anti-Semitism in Russia. So his foreign policy as a whole was a slight positive, as while he did increase the military budget and deployed troops to some foreign countries in the Banana Wars, He avoided any large-scale conflicts, even ending one between Japan and Russia, built the Panama Canal, reinforced the Monroe Doctrine, and gave more local autonomy in Cuba and the Philippines. Teddy was mixed on racial issues. He invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, spoke out against lynchings, and appointed blacks to government jobs, but never invited Booker back after the word of the meeting came out, discharged black soldiers who were accused of killing a local bartender despite the evidence being very shady in the Brownsville affair, and made the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent. He was average relative to era, so it won't affect his grade either way. In summary, Teddy had a fantastic economic policy, making the economy work for everyone, not just the ultra-rich, even if the GDP numbers were a bit mediocre, but a mixed record on everything else puts him in A, just above Grant. As mentioned, Teddy endorsed William Howard Taft as his successor, and Taft soundly defeated William Jennings Bryan in the 1908 presidential election. Bryan had his lowest showing of the popular vote in his 3 campaigns, and lost by 10.25% in the tipping point state of West Virginia. While he still had a fervent fan base within the Democratic Party, the median voter was happy with the state of the country and continued to vote Republican. It seemed like Republicans were invincible. They were progressive enough to win over some left-wing voters, while also being supported by the northern business establishment and most conservative voters. And when Democrats had tried a conservative candidate in Alton Parker, they lost by an even worse margin. They were confined to the South in presidential elections and appeared to have no path to victory. But the House remained close, even with the slaughter on the presidential ticket. Democrats picked up 5 more seats in 1908, retaining almost every southern seat and slowly picking off conservative Republicans as the country became more and more progressive. This accelerated in the 1910 election. Conservative Republicans in Congress who opposed the progressive proposals of Taft and Teddy were defeated by Democrats united behind a progressive platform. Democrats flipped 58 House seats, mostly in the Midwest and New York, and gained the majority. They also gained 9 Senate seats. Taft then lost re-election in 1912 due to Teddy splitting the Republican vote with his third-party run. He then retired from electoral politics, but was named Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921, and is the only president to have ever served on the court. Let's now grade his presidency. I'll start with the issue of tariffs, which was the most contentious of Taft's tenure. Taft was the first Republican to try to decrease tariffs, and so much of his party did not agree with him. He called a special session of Congress to try to lower rates, but the eventual bill congressional Republican leaders passed only reduced rates from 40% to 37%. Even if a majority of the House, composed of most Democrats and some Republicans, would have favored larger cuts, the Speaker of the House and leader of the appropriate Senate committee can always control what people get to vote on. Taft was able to negotiate a corporate tax in the law, but it was only at a 1% rate. He wasn't the most happy with the law because the changes were so minor, but he signed it anyway. In order to pass an income tax, Congress needed to pass an amendment because an 1894 Supreme Court case had said the Constitution didn't allow it. The amendment easily passed Congress and was sent to the states for approval, although it would only pass in 1913, so Taft could never sign an income tax into law. So Taft was good on this issue, he was just limited by members of his own party and previous Supreme Court decisions. Taft attempted to show party unity by defending the final tariff law during the midterms, but fights between conservative and progressive Republicans led to the party losing the House. Progressive voters also voted for Democrats in state legislature races to ensure their state ratified the 16th Amendment, and state legislatures also voted for senators, so that led to the Democrats winning 9 Senate seats. After the midterms, Taft tried to reduce tariffs with Canada via a free trade agreement, but insecure Canadians who feared their businesses would get outcompeted by Americans defeated the incumbent Canadian Prime Minister, and the free trade agreement never passed there. But on the issue of antitrust, Taft was much more successful. Suits to break up Standard Oil and the American Tobacco Company reached their conclusion under him, and the Justice Department also halted a train merger and began a suit against U.S. Steel. In total, 70 antitrust cases were brought up in Taft's 4 years, up from only 40 in Roosevelt's 7. Taft also successfully established postal banking, allowing all Americans access to 2% interest on accounts under $500, or around $10,000 today. Like Teddy, he believed government should work for the average American, not just the wealthy. GDP growth averaged 4% under Taft, which was even better than under Teddy, but I already explained why this isn't the be-all end-all. For more recent years when we have the data, I'll certainly also bring up the poverty and unemployment statistics, as those are as important as GDP growth, but when GDP growth is the only data we have, I'm definitely going to emphasize it. Taft also oversaw the passage of the 17th Amendment in Congress, which made senators voted on by the people as opposed to state legislatures, though like the 16th, it was ratified by the states after he left office, and first went into effect in the 1914 senatorial elections. But Taft was poor on civil rights, appointing fewer blacks to federal jobs than Teddy, so he certainly loses points there. Because Taft spent a lot of political capital on the tariff and he lost the House in 1910, he passed much less legislation than Teddy did in 7.5 years with a Republican Congress. Taft was also less skilled at gaining congressional support for his proposals by using the bully pulpit than Teddy was, and that's going to count against him in his grade. He had a good domestic policy for sure, with few mistakes outside of civil rights, but his lack of real accomplishments in leadership weighs him down. On foreign policy, Taft was also less assertive than Teddy. The US did not mediate any conflicts between nations outside of the Americas like Teddy had with the Russo-Japanese War, and Taft also continued the Banana Wars. He sent troops to Nicaragua to stabilize a pro-American government there after backing a coup against the previous president, who did not support American businesses. He also sent troops to Cuba and Honduras, but those stints were brief and the countries regained their sovereignty. The trickiest situation was with Mexico, and Taft handled it well. He tried to improve relations and became the first American president to visit Mexico. But after the Mexican Revolution broke out, Taft did not intervene, only sending troops to the border to ensure the fighting did not enter the US. He also settled some disputes on the boundary with Canada, even if the free trade bill failed. So overall, a less eventful foreign policy compared to his two predecessors and immediate successor, but I think he was about average. Sending troops in some situations where he shouldn't have, but not increasing military spending and not getting involved in the Mexican Revolution, two things Wilson would end up doing. Combine this with his positive on domestic policy, and I put Taft in B. Like I said, he didn't have any major accomplishments, but everyone in C+ or lower had bigger flaws than Taft, such as the Tariff of Abominations, poor response to the Panic of 1819, use of the army against strikes, and many of them supported slavery, so I'm comfortable putting Taft above them. Now, we finally arrived at the presidential election of 1912, which I've alluded to so many times, and the tenure of Woodrow Wilson. Let's start with the Republican primary. Teddy re-entered politics as soon as he returned from his hunting trip, making speeches promoting his platform of a new nationalism as early as August 1910. He supported the 16th to 18th Amendments, spoke out against lobbying and corruption, and argued for other progressive policies like minimum wages and strong unions. But his preferred candidate for governor of New York lost by 5% in the midterms, so his stock took a bit of a hit. Then Robert La Follette, who I mentioned ran third party in 1924 when both parties nominated conservative candidates, launched the National Progressive Republican League, which was a group like Our Revolution that promoted progressives across the country. He invited Teddy to join, but Teddy declined. La Follette then declared his candidacy for president in 1911, while Teddy waited until February 1912. There were some primary elections back then. La Follette won his home state of Wisconsin, but struggled elsewhere. Taft won the South, while Teddy won most of the North. But unelected conservative delegates supported Taft, and he won the nomination. Teddy ran third party, and La Follette stayed neutral. Wilson was able to win in a landslide thanks to the vote splitting, with Taft and Teddy receiving a very similar amount of the popular vote, though Teddy had way more electoral votes. Strangely enough, even with another third-party option available, 1912 was also Eugene Debs' best showing, winning 6% of the popular vote. Democrats also benefited from vote splitting in the House. Progressives won 10% of the popular vote, but only 9 seats, and Socialists won 7.9%, but lost their only seat. Democrats won 291 seats, and Republicans won 34. Democrats also won the Senate for the first time since 1892, giving Wilson a trifecta. 1912 was the last election before the 17th Amendment was ratified, so now Senate elections were actually directly voted on by the people, so I'll now cover them in more detail. In the midterms, Republicans massively closed the gap in the House. The party regained many progressive members and voters who had switched parties, and the economy had a rough year after World War I started, as foreign investors withdrew their investments to spend money at home. The Treasury Secretary even had to close the stock exchange temporarily. The Democrats actually gained seats in the Senate, because the seats being voted on had previously been voted on in 1908, a Republican landslide year. This is why I said Senate results aren't as useful as House results even when we have the data, because they compare to 6 years prior, not 2. Wilson then narrowly won re-election against Charles Evan Hughes in 1916. Republicans nominated Hughes as a compromise candidate who had both progressive and conservative support. Teddy did support Hughes, but Hughes catered too much to conservatives when they were going to vote for him anyway. He attacked Wilson for supporting policies like an 8-hour workday and income tax. Hughes lost the tipping point state of California, where Hiram Johnson, Teddy's running mate in 1912, was the governor, by 0.3%. In the House, the Progressive Party vanished with Teddy endorsing Hughes, receiving less than 1% of the vote. Republicans consolidated the opposition and won a narrow plurality, though a Democrat remained Speaker. Republicans also gained Senate seats running against a rough 1910 midterm. They then won both houses in 1918. Wilson had run on the slogan "He kept us out of war" in 1916, but he entered World War I soon afterwards, and Democrats suffered as a result. The war ended 6 days after Election Day, so Democrats did get a bit unlucky. But things got even worse for them in the next 2 years. As the Spanish flu hit the US, Wilson suffered from a stroke, and the treaty to join the League of Nations failed. There was a massive backlash to his term, and after the 1920 elections finished, Republicans had 169 more House seats than they did 8 years prior, and 19 more Senate seats than they did 6 years prior, with each seat getting voted on once in that 6-year period. The backlash to Wilson, death of Teddy in 1919, and the Harding-Coolidge landslide in the presidential election led to conservative Republicans dominating Washington until the Great Depression in 1929. Now let's examine Wilson's term and see if he was as bad as voters thought at the end of it. Let's start evaluating Wilson's tenure with World War I. It began in June 1914 after Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which I'll shorten AH from now on, was assassinated by Bosnian Serbs who were mad that AH had annexed Bosnia in 1908. AH demanded Serbia apologize, censor and prosecute Bosnian groups, and arrest military officers who were believed to have helped plan the assassination. Serbia refused, Germany backed AH, Russia backed Serbia, France backed Russia, and war broke out. Britain joined after Germany invaded Belgium en route to France, and the Ottoman Empire joined to fight Serbia and Russia, who they had fought in recent years in wars that caused them to lose most of their European territory. They also committed the Armenian genocide during the war. What was the American position? At first, the US was neutral and tried to bring all sides to a peace negotiation. They continued trading with both sides, but after the British ship Lusitania, which also had American passengers, was sunk in 1915, Wilson asked Germany nicely to not attack US ships and also allow survivors to evacuate after attacking other ships, which they agreed to at first. And when Britain blockaded Germany, Wilson didn't attempt to bypass it, as the US didn't trade as much with Germany as they did with Britain. So they were slightly on Britain's side, but still officially neutral at this point. The US also gave out loans to both sides of the war, but again, mostly to Britain. But in 1916, Congress passed the Naval Expansion Act, part of the preparedness movement to get the US ready to join the war if needed. As mentioned, Wilson ran on "he kept us out of war" and won re-election in 1916, even though the US was spending more on its military than it had prior. The calculus changed in 1917. As Germany informed the US they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, the US intercepted the Zimmermann telegram sent by Germany to try to get Mexico to attack the US, and the US determined the Black Tom explosion, an event in 1916 when US munitions set to be shipped to Russia exploded, was deliberate sabotage by Germany. The US declared war on Germany in April and AH later that year. In the events to this point, I think Wilson had a pretty good policy. He probably shouldn't have increased military spending in 1916, as the US still wasn't in the war yet, but besides that, he didn't join the war too early and waited until Germany explicitly started attacking American ships and tried to get Mexico to attack the US directly as well. But Wilson's actions during the war were a lot worse. The worst actions were the Espionage and Sedition Acts and the Draft. The first two were used to squash free speech, mostly of socialists opposed to the war. Eugene Debs and many others were put in jail for opposing the draft on the justification that they were a threat to national security, and the conservative Supreme Court at the time upheld the law. This continued after the war during the first Red Scare, and the Espionage Act is still used today, now to jail whistleblowers who expose US war crimes. The Sedition Act strengthened it, but Wilson did repeal that at the end of his tenure, but obviously this was still a violation of the First Amendment and a massive black mark on his tenure. The ACLU was founded in 1917 to oppose these two acts, and many Republicans, including Teddy, also did. These two acts were part of the reason for large Republican gains in the 1918 midterms. The US also deported immigrant anarchists after the Immigration Act of 1918, but unlike Debs, these anarchists actually did commit violence, with a series of bombings carried out by Luigi Galliani, so that law was much more defensible. But I'm not going to defend the draft. It was bad under Lincoln, and here it was even worse as the war was on the other side of the world, even if it was defensive for the US to join the war given the submarine warfare and Zimmermann telegram. I won't repeat my criticisms of it from Lincoln's tenure, but if you had to sign up for the Selective Service, I hope you agree with me and try to get Congress to repeal it. Wilson also introduced daylight savings time, which I personally hate, but that's not such a big deal compared to these other actions. But the actual running of the war went quite well, and it ended only a year and a half after the US entered. Wilson released his plans for the peace with the 14 points in January 1918, and it was a fantastic document for an enduring peaceful world order. In fact, Germany began negotiations specifically with the US long before their territory was invaded, making it clear that his fairness helped end the war sooner and save thousands of lives, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And when you compare the 14 points with the Treaty of Versailles, which actually ended the war, the differences were always for the worse. Some of the good things made it in, such as more autonomy for oppressed nations, leading to the breakup of AH and the Ottoman Empire, and the creation of countries like Poland, Austria and Hungary themselves, Armenia, and many more. Although Wilson's desired nation of Kurdistan was not created, and that has led to issues that persist today. But during the peace process, France lobbied to force the German government to pay reparations, leading to a lot of resentment that became part of the reason for Hitler's rise to power. Wilson also called for the end to secret treaties, global arms control, and an end to colonialism in his 14 points, none of which made it in the final treaty. But the biggest issue for Wilson domestically was the League of Nations, which was also envisioned by his 14 points. The League had a tenet that if one of its members were attacked, the others would have an obligation to protect its independence and territory. Anti-interventionist members in Congress found this to be very objectionable, and Wilson suffered his stroke by this point, so he was unable to lobby for the League's laws to change, so the Treaty of Versailles failed in the US Senate. Funnily enough, this is very similar to Article 5 of NATO, but the US founded that anyway, as when that was signed, Americans were much more on board with interventionism. Overall, Wilson is a slight positive on the war. His decision of when to enter the war was great, but he loses points for his domestic policy of the draft and violations of the First Amendment. But the fact that his fairness towards Germany likely helped the war end early and save thousands of lives makes his policy a positive overall. I also give him a bit of a pass on events that happened after his stroke, as that wasn't his fault. Nowadays, the 25th Amendment would be invoked and the Vice President would take over, so him not being able to change the rules of the League in my opinion, is not his fault. But there were also a lot of other events during his presidency, so let's move on. Let's finish evaluating Wilson's foreign policy. The Panama Canal opened in 1914, and Wilson ensured all nations would pay the same toll, upholding the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty from McKinley's presidency. But he also continued the banana wars in Latin America. The US went back into Nicaragua to protect the president there, who was friendly to American businesses, and built a naval base in the local bay, despite El Salvador suing over the issue and the Central American Court of Justice siding with El Salvador. The US also went into Haiti after the president was assassinated and ensured the new government was stable and that foreigners would be allowed to own land. There were also short involvements in Cuba and Honduras, again to help American businesses. But these weren't as egregious as what he did in the Dominican Republic. Wilson sent troops to protect an American-owned sugarcane plantation. The troops stayed there for 8 years and killed 1,000 Dominicans. And Wilson also got involved in the Mexican Revolution. Taft had sent troops to the border to make sure the fighting didn't enter the US, but Wilson went further. He refused to recognize the government of Victoriano Huerta and demanded Mexico hold new elections to replace him. After they didn't, Wilson sent troops to Veracruz, killing 170 Mexican soldiers. I will defend him for later sending troops to Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa, who entered the US and killed American soldiers, but the original hostility to Mexico is why Germany tried to get them to attack the US with the Zimmermann telegram. Wilson even sent troops to Russia to protect the Tsarist regime from the communists during the Russian Civil War. I will slightly defend this action. The communists nationalized industries without compensating American companies that owned part of them, and refused to pay off debt from the previous regime, thus invalidating US loans given out during World War I. Additionally, Wilson wanted Ukraine and Czechoslovakia to become independent from Russia like he had done with Poland, so this wasn't just a war to uphold a corrupt, unelected Tsar against communist rebels. But the troops sent there were poorly prepared to fight in Russia, as is true with all armies that have tried to invade there, and the US ran away with its tail between its legs. The intervention was a miserable failure, and another negative for Wilson. But I will give Wilson some credit. He was against colonialism in his 14 points, and that also played out with his handling of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. He signed the Jones Act, which created a Philippine-elected government and reinforced the commitment to eventual self-rule. Puerto Rico was given an elected Senate, and its citizens were made US citizens. Still, the offensive interventions in so many countries outweigh the positives of Wilson's World War I policy, as the 14 points were not fully realized in the Treaty of Versailles, and World War II happened 20 years later. So overall, Wilson was in negative on foreign policy. On economic policy, Wilson continued the progressive era. With the 16th Amendment ratified, he cut tariffs by 14% and imposed an income tax that only affected the top 3% of earners at a 6% rate. This balanced the budget until the preparedness movement meant larger military spending, and then the top rate was increased to 15% in 1916. Once the US actually joined the war, rates ballooned to 67% on the highest earners and up to 12% on people who paid nothing before. Wilson also instated excess profits taxes on businesses to put a cap on war profiteering. Taxes were also placed on luxury goods, tobacco, and liquor, reducing income inequality by taxing the highest earners, reducing costs by cutting tariffs, and going after war profiteering gave Wilson a fantastic grade on his tax policy. He also signed the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which reinforced the Sherman Act, and created the Federal Trade Commission, so he was good on antitrust. And on labor, he signed working hours and child labor laws, although the Lochner-era Supreme Court overruled many of them. When unemployment went down as the war began, unions gained members and workers saw their wages increase, and Wilson mediated strikes instead of crushing them. But when soldiers returned from war, unemployment increased drastically, and unfortunately Wilson was preoccupied with the Treaty of Versailles' fate in the Senate and then suffered his stroke, so the economy sank into a recession from 1919 to 1921. There was double-digit inflation in the war years, but that was unavoidable. Wilson also signed the Federal Reserve Act, a compromise between conservatives who wanted private banks to remain powerful and progressives who wanted a central bank. It's better than nothing but has plenty of flaws, so I view it as a neutral. Growth averaged 3% before the post-war recession and Spanish flu led to contraction, so by that measure Wilson's economic policy was mediocre. But I'll still give him a positive, as he continued the progressive era policies of decreasing income inequality, protecting unions, and going after trusts. But speaking of the Spanish flu, Wilson was poor on that. He barely did anything about it, and it likely killed a similar proportion of the US population as COVID. In fact, it's likely he himself contracted it in 1919, before the Paris Peace Conference. I understand that there were other things going on, but certainly doing nothing was the wrong response. He was also famously poor on civil rights, segregating the military and federal government, screening the pro-KK film Birth of a Nation at the White House, which led to the group regaining popularity, and doing nothing about race riots. Black people began leaving the South in what was known as the Great Migration as industry moved north, but obviously there was also racial animus there, which Wilson did nothing about. He did speak out against lynching as being against due process, but he was still easily the worst president on civil rights since Andrew Johnson. But Wilson was good on immigration. He vetoed the 1917 Immigration Act that required literacy tests, though it was overridden. He also opposed California's alien land law, which banned Japanese non-citizens from owning land, but also he couldn't do anything to prevent that. On prohibition, after the 18th Amendment was ratified, Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act, which enforced it, but his veto was overridden there too. Prohibition turned out horribly, with people dying from drinking tainted alcohol and organized crime gaining a foothold in the US, so another good but ultimately pointless veto. And on women's suffrage, Wilson originally took the Democratic position of opposing it because Democrats liked states' rights since they wanted to disenfranchise blacks as well. But he changed his mind to support it and rallied senators to vote for it to pass the Senate, and the 19th Amendment became ratified in August 1920. So overall, Wilson was a negative on foreign policy, including the Espionage and Sedition Acts in that category, a positive on the economy, though he simply continued the policy of his predecessors and had mediocre growth, so he was not a major positive, and a negative on various other issues, with his bad actions on the flu and civil rights being higher impact than vetoes that were overridden on prohibition and immigration. So he was certainly a negative overall, but he is overhated by people who think he's one of the worst presidents ever. Like I said, I give him a pass by not blaming him for his post-stroke tenure, so maybe those people blame him for the economy being bad in 1920 and failing to adjust the League of Nations Charter to get the US to join. But I'm going to put him in C-, above Jackson and Cleveland. Still, voters rebuked him heavily and elected 3 conservative Republicans after him, starting with Warren Harding. How good were they? Next up we have Warren Harding. He won in a landslide in 1920 I've already alluded to, and died before finishing his term, so I'll omit his elections and cover them under his successor. Harding had a very conservative economic policy. Income taxes under Wilson were 10% for those earning $6,000 a year, and increased 1% for every $2,000 increase in earnings up to $98K, then up to 73% for $1 million a year or more in income. Harding's tax cut kept the rate the same for anyone making $4K a year or less, or around $50K a year today, decreased it by 1 to 2% for everyone making $6K to $98K, and then cut the rate by 4 to 15% for the highest earners. So the tax cut benefited the ultra-rich way more than the poor. Corporate taxes were lowered and excess profits taxes abolished. Even with these rates, the debt to GDP ratio decreased with no more war spending, so the size of the cut was not too big, but they should have benefited poorer Americans more. Harding also signed increases in tariffs. These help the economy in the short term, as people buy domestic goods instead of foreign ones, but after other countries raise tariffs in response, exports fall. And tariffs increase prices and help domestic monopolies who face less competition. Growth was 5.6% in 1922 and 13.2% in 23, but this was just a natural recovery from the post-war recession. It averaged 3.4% until the Great Depression, which is good but not spectacular, and these laws led to the Depression, so the conservative policies of this era were bad for the economy. That applies to Harding as well as his 2 successors. Trickle-down doesn't create boom-bust cycles, it creates booms for the rich and busts for the poor. Harding also vetoed payments to veterans, many of whom struggled to find a job after coming back from the war, were struggling financially, and had been drafted to fight in a war against their own wishes. He was also poor on labor issues, breaking up coal and rail strikes, although he did endorse 8-hour days for steel mill workers. He was also weak on antitrust, not prosecuting big companies. And even though he only served 2.5 years, Harding appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court, and besides Taft, who became Chief Justice, there were strong conservatives who continued the Lochner era. But Harding did reduce waste in government by creating the Bureau of the Budget and Government Accountability Offices, which oversee government programs and make sure the public can know where money is spent. He also signed the Shepherdtown or Maternity Act, which helped pregnant women and young children remain healthy, and led to a large decrease in infant mortality and deaths in childbirth. Additionally, he signed the Federal Highway Act, which improved transportation and created road-building jobs. So Harding was certainly bad on the economy, but he had a few bright spots. On race, Harding was also poor. He signed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, right after Wilson refused to sign it in the lame duck session. This act restricted the number of immigrants admitted from a country in a year to 3% of the amount currently in the US, which meant the UK and Germany, which already had a lot of immigrants in the US, would be allowed to have more, while Eastern Europe would largely not, and Asian immigration was even more restricted. And on civil rights, Harding was better than Wilson, but he didn't desegregate the federal government, so the damage Wilson had done remained. On other domestic issues, Harding was again better than Wilson when he released many individuals convicted by the Espionage and Sedition Acts, including Eugene Debs. But the rampant corruption of his administration is probably the best known part of his presidency. I won't name all the scandals that took place, but the Teapot Dome, related to oil reserves in Wyoming, is the best known one. Unlike Grant, Harding took no actions to try to prevent this, and after his death, his wife tried to burn many of his letters, so perhaps there was explicit evidence of his involvement in them. Harding also served alcohol in the White House while enforcing Prohibition, so he didn't even care about looking elitist. So his domestic policy was horrible. But Harding's foreign policy was good. He didn't start any new interventions and withdrew troops from Cuba. The US also compensated Colombia for their involvement in the Panamanian Independence War. Harding also began trade with Russia, and the US gave them food aid during their famine in 1921. relations improved with Mexico, and the US recognized them 1 month after Harding's death. The US also decreased military spending and got Britain and Japan to do the same, although once the treaty expired, Japan started attacking nearby nations, leading to World War II, so that was not very successful in the long run. And many countries struggled to pay back their war debts to the US, so Harding allowed the payments to be stretched over decades with a low interest rate so the countries wouldn't default. So he was definitely a positive on foreign policy. While Harding's economic philosophy was bad, the tax cuts during just his presidency weren't that egregious, so most of the blame for the Great Depression goes on his two successors and not him. Of course, the corruption scandals were really bad, he was poor on other economic policies like antitrust, and his racial policies were also quite poor. But his peaceful foreign policy that improved US relations with numerous countries, and lack of longevity, which is a good thing when you're a bad president, make him better than all the people in F. I place Harding right above McKinley, who was almost as corrupt, had a similar economic philosophy, and a horrible foreign policy instead of a good one. How did Harding die? In summer 1923, he went on a tour of the West, including Vancouver, which made him the first president to visit Canada while in office. But he caught pneumonia, collapsed on an event, and soon died of a heart attack. He was succeeded by his VP, Calvin Coolidge.
Now back to the 1920 election. This was the first election after the 19th Amendment was ratified, which gave women the right to vote in every state. Republicans nominated Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding and Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, while Democrats nominated Ohio Governor James Cox and former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was little known at the time, so his presence on the ballot didn't help, but he became governor of New York in 1929, and of course, president for 12 years. Harding ran against Wilson's foreign policy and the bad economy of the post-war recession, and won every non-Confederate state, plus Tennessee. Republicans won big cities with Irish and German immigrants, who were mad that the US held Britain and fought Germany, and struggling economies from the post-war recession. They flipped 10 House seats in New York, 8 in Ohio, and 8 in Pennsylvania, expanding their seat count to 302. They also gained 10 Senate seats, running against 1914 when Democrats retained the House and gained Senate seats. But the 1922 elections went poorly for Republicans. They lost 77 House seats and 7 Senate seats. The Farmer Labor Party also gained its first seats. It's the regional party to Minnesota that would merge with the Democrats in 1944. Foreign policy played a much smaller role than 2 years prior, prohibition began to become unpopular, and the economy was still mediocre, with Harding's main moves being tax cuts for the rich and increasing costs by raising tariffs. Veterans were also mad about not having good jobs or pay for their participation in the war. Harding then died before the next election, and Coolidge became president, but he was able to win re-election handily. The economy finally recovered with strong growth in 1923, and the corruption scandals were blamed entirely on Harding. Republicans gained seats down ballot, picking up 22 House seats and 1 Senate seat. Still, they had fewer seats than they did 4 years prior in both houses. But the presidential election was much more lopsided due to a poor Democratic candidate. John W. Davis won on the 103rd ballot at the Democratic Convention, so even the delegates didn't really like him. He had poor name recognition and basically ran on the same platform as Coolidge, so Northern voters saw no reason to vote for him. His running mate was William Jennings Bryan's brother, Charles Bryan, but William's magic had run out a long time ago, so his brother being on the ballot was not going to make a difference. By the way, William himself would argue in favor of creationism the next year in the famous Scopes monkey trial. The only reason Davis won any states is because he was pro-segregation and later argued for it at the Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board case near the end of his life. So he won all the Confederate states, except Kentucky, and also won Oklahoma, but received the smallest popular vote share by a Democrat in U.S. history. Even Stephen Douglas, who only won one state in a four-way race in 1860, won a larger percentage of the vote. Robert La Follette ran third party against the two conservatives and had a pretty good showing of 16.6% of the vote, and he won his home state of Wisconsin. But after his death in 1925, the progressive wing of the Republican Party died with him. Since then, there have been moderate and liberal Republicans, like Susan Collins or Nelson Rockefeller, but no progressives. In 1926, Republicans lost 6 Senate seats running against their 1920 landslide and 9 House seats, but retained both houses. Coolidge declined to seek re-election even though he only served 5 years. His 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., died of sepsis during his presidency, so he was depressed and not happy with the job. He retired and died in 1933. Now let's go over his tenure. Coolidge's policies were very similar to his predecessors. He further decreased income taxes, lowering the top rate to 25%, but also reduced rates for the poor more than Harding did. The rates on those making $4,000 a year went to 3% from 8%, and more deductions were added, making it so only 2% of the population paid any income tax. And while he didn't reduce tariffs, he didn't increase them either, so Coolidge was better than Harding on tax policy. The debt went from $22.3 billion in 1923 to $16.9 billion in 1929, so these rates were enough to pay for all the spending and more. Like Harding, Coolidge vetoed the bonus bill to pay veterans, though his veto was overwritten. He was also weak on antitrust, and he further decreased immigration with the Immigration Act of 1924. But he was better than Harding on labor issues. He didn't mediate strikes, but that's still better than intervening to oppose them. Coolidge enforced prohibition, but didn't serve alcohol in the White House, was slightly better on civil rights by not appointing any KKK members to federal positions, though the government stayed segregated,
and he signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which made all native citizens, though most already were. So on all of these issues, he was either as bad as Harding or only slightly better. Coolidge also had a poor response to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, reminiscent of Cleveland's veto of the Texas Seed Bill. He didn't believe it was federal government's responsibility to help states in need. And he also appointed J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the Bureau of Investigation, who at this point was known for carrying out anti-communist raids during the First Red Scare and arresting people under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Not all of the blame on Hoover's 50-year tenure goes on Coolidge, as plenty of future presidents could have fired him had they wanted, but it was still a bad decision, even with just the information known about Hoover at the time. One positive was Coolidge's opposition to farm subsidies. The use of tractors improved productivity, which led to overproduction, and some congressmen wanted the government to buy excess crops so farmers would be guaranteed to have customers. Coolidge vetoed the bill, thus incentivizing a more efficient economy instead of distorting the market, but he didn't do the actual solution, which was lowering tariffs so other countries would, and the crops could be exported overseas. And most importantly, compared to Harding, Coolidge was not associated with any corruption scandals. So Coolidge was better than Harding on domestic issues, but he was still a clear negative on that front, as a lot of his policies were the reason for the Great Depression a few years later. Like Harding, Coolidge also had a largely peaceful foreign policy. The US recognized Mexico's government, and relations with them improved and have been good ever since. Though troops remained in Nicaragua and Haiti, Coolidge withdrew troops from the Dominican Republic, apologized for US interventions in Latin America at the 6th International Conference of American States, and gave loans and good trade deals to several Latin American countries. He further reduced military spending, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed, which was an agreement that countries would not declare war. It was unenforceable and didn't really do anything, but it served as the inspiration for later international agreements that had teeth, including the ones that prosecuted Nazi and Japanese leaders after World War II. Finally, European countries were still struggling with debt repayment, including Germany with the reparations they owed. Coolidge approved the Dawes Plan, which helped relieve Germany from their crushing debt and hyperinflation problems. Germany's economy improved. This ended up backfiring because Hitler came to power and then World War II started. But the blame on the reparations and crisis that led up to the Dawes Plan fall on France, who occupied the Ruhr Valley of Germany to force Germany to export them coal. They were much more the reason for Hitler's rise to power than anything Coolidge did. Secretary of State Dawes won the Nobel Peace Prize for this plan, and it was another positive aspect of Coolidge's foreign policy. So in summary, Coolidge was basically a better Harding. He was comparable on economic, racial, and foreign policy issues, and had the benefit of not being corrupt. But he hired Hoover instead of pardoning Debs, so he wasn't better in every area. I'll still put him in C-, above Harding in D, and above Cleveland, as Cleveland's crushing of strikes and poor response to the Panic of 1893 were worse than anything Coolidge did. But I'll put him below Wilson, as the appointment of Hoover shows Coolidge was okay with the people who enforced the Espionage and Sedition Acts, two of Wilson's worst policies. And outside of those acts, Wilson was probably a positive on foreign policy and was much better on the economy, so I think he's better than Coolidge overall, even though he was much more racist, as like I mentioned, Coolidge didn't overturn Wilson's racism. After Coolidge declined to run for president, Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover, who had served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, and led the U.S. Food and Relief Administrations under Wilson, helping distribute U.S. crops to starving people in Central and Eastern Europe during and after the war. Hoover's vice president was Charles Curtis, who I mentioned under McKinley. He was Native American, and became the highest-serving non-white in U.S. history until Obama became president. They beat Democrat Al Smith in the 1928 presidential election. Smith was a Catholic, so he faced a lot of prejudice and lost many southern states. But this also made him more popular amongst Catholic immigrants in northern states. Smith was able to win Massachusetts and only lost New York by 2%. So while the electoral vote makes it look like Smith was the least successful of the last three Democratic candidates, he actually had the best performance of them in the popular vote. He lost by only 17%, while the last two lost by over 25%. Democrats had certainly regained some popularity from their lowest point, but they lost 7 Senate seats running against the successful 1922 election and lost 30 House seats as well. But the Great Depression changed everything. In the midterms, Democrats gained 52 House seats and 8 Senate seats. Republican policies were blamed for the economic collapse, and Republicans kept losing until 1938, when, in my opinion, the next party system began after Republicans accepted parts of the New Deal and weren't as conservative as they were under Harding and Coolidge. Hoover got obliterated in his re-election bid in 1932 by FDR. Was his response to the Great Depression really that poor, or did he just get unlucky? Let's find out. First, let's learn why the Depression happened. It began with the October 1929 stock market crash. A stock market bubble had formed after so many years of tax cuts and deregulation. Banks invested people's savings in the stock market, and many traders borrowed money with low interest rates to invest it in the stock market, known as margin trading. But GDP growth only averaged 3.4% from 1924 to 1929, while stocks rose 20% per year from 1923 until the crash. GDP growth further slowed to 1% in 1927 and 28, as once households had things like cars and radios, they weren't going to buy more, but stocks continued increasing at the same pace. And the rich got richer while wages increased by less, so the average person often purchased things like cars on payment plans, which made the upcoming crash even worse. Before the crash, The extra money the rich had was being invested in things like stocks or property, leading to bubbles in those areas, but once the crash happened, a lot of these loans got defaulted on and people would lose their cars or radios. But why did the bubble burst when it did? First, the Federal Reserve raised the interest rate in August and the Bank of England did so in September. In order to maintain gold reserves and not have foreign investors buy gold in exchange for currency, banks raised interest rates to keep inflation low. So having dollars or dollar-denominated investments would be better than keeping gold and selling it later after inflation caused the gold price to increase. This is kind of like the concept of negative real interest rates I've talked about before, where when inflation is high, you want to have actual goods instead of money, and that includes gold when there's a gold standard currency. Then in late September, United Steel companies collapsed after fraud by Clarence Hatchery in Britain. British investors then withdrew money from the US after stocks fell in the UK. In early October, British Chancellor of the Exchequer Phil Snowden and US Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon pointed out the emperor had no clothes and called out the stock market for being a bubble. Prices had slowly declined since early September, but they fell further after these statements. Finally, the dam broke and prices cratered from October 24th to 29th. And because of all the margin trading and the fact that investment banks directly invested in the stock market, a lot of people defaulted on their loans and the banks themselves lost money. This led to many banks failing, which led to panic and withdrawals from other banks, which led to those banks failing. Again, this is why these events are called panics. Once the first bank crashes, many soon follow. The Federal Reserve did not stabilize these banks, as it would later in the Great Recession of 2008. Most economists blamed the Fed's response for exacerbating the effects of the Depression. And as banks failed, the money supply decreased. People had less money, so prices decreased, which made old loans harder to pay off because it led to a higher real interest rate, which led to more banks failing, and the deflationary spiral started as well. Deflation was 3.7%, 10.3%, and 11.7% from 1930 to 32. GDP fell by 8.5, 6.4, and 12.9% in those years, and unemployment went from 3.2% in 1929 to 24.9% in 1933. Businesses went bankrupt and consumer spending crashed as people lost their savings, and the whole economy suffered. What was Hoover's response? Well, some of his actions made things worse. In June 1930, he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which increased rates on imported goods massively. Other countries retaliated, and international trade and finance ground to a halt. And because other countries still owed the US money from their World War I loans, or in the case of Germany, loans made to pay reparations, their economies collapsed from the freeze on trade and inability to pay back loans. Hitler's party went from 12 seats to 95 at the next German election, Franco began taking over in Spain, and Japan became more militaristic as nationalism increased around the globe. And this act also greatly hurt the US. Americans bought fewer goods after the Depression began, so overseas customers were more important, but the retaliatory tariffs limited the US's ability to export goods. And make things worse, the US was hit by the Dust Bowl starting in 1931. Farmers were desperate in the prior years, overplowing farmland to try to make more money immediately, but the bare soils led to droughts and dust storms, causing much lower crop yields in the following years. This continued until 1938, and many farmers moved west to places like California in search of jobs and farmland that hadn't been ruined. This is what the book Grapes of Wrath is about, but don't read it, it's really boring. In order to reduce unemployment, Hoover deported hundreds and thousands of Mexicans, including children born in the US who had birthright citizenship. This action was probably slightly positive for the economy, as in a situation as dire as the Great Depression where unemployment is 25%, having a larger labor pool was not a good thing, but it's unconstitutional to deport US citizens. And early on in his presidency, he basically asked business owners nicely to not decrease wages or fire employees. But corporations only care about profit, so they did what was best for themselves and fired employees anyway. When it came to government playing an active role to help the economy, Hoover initially resisted, vetoing the Muscle-Schultz bill, which was similar to FDR's later Tennessee Valley Authority. But after the 1930 midterms, he finally acquiesced to congressional demands. Congress authorized $116 million in spending for jobs for the millions of unemployed Americans. Many public works projects were started, including the Hoover Dam. In July 1932, Hoover went further with the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, which put more money towards government jobs. He also signed regulations on banks, such as the Reconstruction Finance Commission, National Credit Corporation, Federal Home Loan Bank Act, and the First Glass-Steagall Act. The Fed also intervened to stop deflation, and inflation was positive from 1934 until the recession of 1938, although part of that is also attributable to FDR's policies. But even then, Hoover was still obsessed with balancing the budget. He signed the Revenue Act of 1932, which increased income tax rates. It was largely progressive, raising the highest rate to 63%, but it affected poorer earners as well. And Hoover maintained the gold standard throughout his tenure, which worsened the deflation. Britain left the gold standard in September 1931, but Hoover refused to do the same. Had Hoover just deficit spent earlier in his tenure, not raised tariffs, and abandoned the gold standard, the Depression would not have been nearly as bad and would just be known as the Panic of 1929. He was worried about inflation, but inflation is a good thing when the economy is in freefall and there's currently deflation. So Hoover gets terrible marks for his response to the Depression. He was slightly better in his last 2 years, but it was too little too late, And as I mentioned, some of the biggest increases in unemployment and decreases in GDP were in those years. Hoover was also bad on many other issues. On prohibition, well, he said, if citizens do not like a law, their duty as honest men and women is to discourage its violation, their right is to openly work for its repeal. He ignored public protest against the law and continued strenuously enforcing prohibition throughout his tenure. The 21st Amendment ended prohibition in December 1933 after FDR took office. Hoover's agricultural policies were also poor. He signed the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929 after Coolidge had vetoed similar legislation. This act created the Federal Farm Board, which was given $500 million to buy surplus crops from farmers. This led to the overproduction that caused the dust storm, as the government would buy crops no matter what, but after the Farm Board ran out of money, crop prices crashed due to overproduction. This contributed to the deflation in the first few years of the Depression, and also caused the dust storm which led to poor harvests and people starving in the later years. Like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, this law made the Depression worse. Hoover also vetoed the bonus loan bill, which would allow veterans who were paid bonds in 1924 to redeem their bonds early, since most of them needed the money now. Thousands of veterans marched to Washington, D.C. in a group known as the Bonus Army to lobby the government to change its mind. But Hoover sent out the current army, led by Douglas MacArthur, who crushed the march and cleared out the tents the protesters had set up. Hoover approved of MacArthur's actions, but faced massive public backlash for his position on this issue, contributing to his landslide re-election loss. Additionally, Hoover continued the Republican Party's departure from its founding principles as he was poor on civil rights. He nominated a racist Southerner to the Supreme Court, though the nomination was defeated, and removed black Republicans from positions of power in the South in order to cater to the racists there and try to win elections. However, this didn't work for him in 1932. The only reason he won the South in 1928 is because Al Smith was a Catholic. Black voters then became Democratic starting in 1932, as Republicans didn't speak up for them on civil rights, and Democrats were better for them on economic issues. And after LBJ, when the Democratic Party has been strongly in favor of civil rights and the Republicans have been wishy-washy, blacks have voted over 85% for Democrats in the presidential ticket. But for one last positive on domestic policy, Hoover was good on labor issues. He advocated for 8-hour workdays and signed the pro-labor Norris-LaGuardia Act. His small government views extended to not interfering with strikes, as the act banned federal courts from allowing injunctions against non-violent strikes. But this does juxtapose strangely with his position on the Bonus Army March and his crushing of that. Overall, he was overwhelmingly terrible on domestic policy. But like his two predecessors, his positive foreign policy rescues his grade and gets him out of F. He continued to push for disarmament, signing the London Naval Treaty in 1930. But the Japanese leader who signed the treaty was assassinated in November 1930 and replaced by hardline nationalists. Japan then invaded Manchuria in 1931 and left the League of Nations. The US made its opposition to the invasion known, issuing the Stimson Doctrine that the US would not recognize territories gained by force. Similarly, the US prevented a war between China and Russia after conflicts in Manchuria, which at the time was disputed between those two countries. Japan fought both of them in World War II and took it over. Hoover also largely ended the US interventions in Latin America. The US left Nicaragua and oversaw elections in Haiti in 1930 and then planned withdrawal, which came in 1934. Hoover did veto the bill for Philippine independence, but it's not like the US was brutal in that region anymore, and he wanted it to remain a good trading partner for the US during the difficult financial times. Its independence would come in 1946, after World War II ended and Japan was no longer attacking it. And as mentioned earlier, loan repayment remained an issue. The US halted collections of loans for 1 year, and later indefinitely. This included loans Germany took, so again, Germany starting World War II made that portion of it backfire, but that wasn't his fault. In fact, the 95 seats won by the Nazis in 1930 only made them the second largest party in the German parliament, so it was fine for Hoover to treat Germany fairly. And after Hitler took over during the lame duck portion of Hoover's presidency, the repayment freeze for the UK was made permanent in order to combat him. Overall, Hoover was very similar to his two predecessors in his ideology and grade. While the Great Depression wasn't caused by him, his response was absolutely dreadful and why it became a global depression and not just the Panic of 1929. So I will put him in D, below Coolidge, as Coolidge didn't increase tariffs and vetoed similar farm bills to the one Hoover signed, but still above Harding, as Harding also increased tariffs and was incredibly corrupt, and Hoover's last 2 years weren't as bad as his first two. Let's now move on to FDR and see how he dealt with the Depression. Our last president for the day is FDR. As mentioned, he won the governorship of New York in 1928, and then became the Democratic nominee for president in 1932. Al Smith was actually governor of New York before FDR, and he ran for the Democratic nomination to challenge Hoover again, but FDR easily won it. His running mate was House Speaker John Nance Garner, a conservative Southerner. Garner balanced the ticket and was skilled at getting FDR's New Deal legislation passed once in office. They won in a landslide against Hoover, who only won a few wealthy northeastern states that weren't as badly hurt by the Depression as the rest of the country. FDR won cities, which had huge unemployment problems, the West, as he espoused pro-farmer policies, and the South, as he wasn't Catholic like Al Smith, and they liked his economic policies, even if he wasn't racist like previous Democratic nominees. The wealthy suburbs were the only areas of the country where Hoover won, but those voters were a minority of the population. Democrats also won massive majorities in Congress, flipping 97 House seats and 12 Senate seats. Voters blamed Republicans in Congress just as much as they did Hoover. FDR then broke the midterm curse as Democrats picked up 9 more House seats in 1934. It was the first time the incumbent party gained House seats since 1902, and that year the gains were just due to the census adding new seats, so it was really the first time since 1818. The Progressive Party gained its first seats. It was created by Robert La Follette's sons and operated only in Wisconsin. They left the Republican Party as it was now clearly pro-business, but they disagreed with the Democrats on foreign policy, so they formed a third party. Democrats also gained 10 more Senate seats in 1934. The success for Democrats then continued in 1936 as FDR won by an even wider margin than 4 years prior. The economy grew by an average of 10.9% from 1934 to 1936, and unemployment was down to 14.3% in 1937 from 25% in 1933, so voters approved of the incumbent party that had ended the Depression. FDR's opponent, Kansas Governor Alf Landon, attacked FDR's New Deal policies and claimed big government would lead to people losing their personal liberties, but voters did not find his case convincing, and he only won 2 states, again both rich northeastern states, and lost by 24% of the popular vote. Democrats also won 7 more Senate seats and 12 more House seats. Republicans were only 20% of the House and 17% of the Senate, and it seemed like they might go extinct. But they saw a massive revival in 1938. The economy had a rough year, with GDP falling by 3.3% and unemployment rising by 4.7%. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court, but faced massive backlash, including from his own party, and his second New Deal was more controversial than the first, and Republicans moderated from their extreme laissez-faire ideology of the 1920s. Their unpopular members lost their seats in the previous 3 elections, and now their new candidates were not associated with the Hoover administration's policies and accepted parts of FDR's agenda. This marks the beginning of the 5th party system of the post-New Deal consensus, but I'll cover that in part 3 of this series. Republicans nearly doubled their House total and gained 7 Senate seats. Still, Democrats kept majorities in both houses, and FDR won a 3rd term in 1940. Not running for a 3rd term was only a tradition at this point, not a law, and FDR was the most popular Democrat by far, so he faced only minor opposition in the primary. FDR also chose a new VP, as Garner broke with his court-packing plan and some of his big government policies. He chose Henry Wallace, who had been his Secretary of Agriculture and was a strong progressive. But this time FDR won by less than 10% against Republican Wendell Willkie. Willkie won 8 Midwest states and Big Sky states Landon had lost, largely due to FDR starting a peacetime draft in 1940, and gained elsewhere due to FDR's economic policy being less popular than 4 years prior. FDR only won by 6.9% in the tipping point state of Pennsylvania, as the massive margins in the South for Democrats meant that they ran up the total in the popular vote more than they did in the Electoral College. But voters still trusted FDR more than Willkie, who was a Democrat until 1939 and had never held political office before. Plus, the economy recovered from the 1938 recession and grew by 8% in 39 and 40. This allowed Democrats to gain 5 House seats, although they lost 3 Senate seats, as they had to run against their landslide from 1934. The 1942 midterms were more about foreign policy than any election since 1920. The US joined World War II after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. With many men overseas fighting and unable to vote, turnout was very low, so those who did vote were less likely to support how the war was being conducted. FDR restricted free speech, though less than Wilson, and interned Japanese Americans, believing they were possibly spies for the Japanese government. War profiteering and waste was revealed by congressional committees, including one led by Harry Truman, and taxes reached their highest levels in US history to pay for the war. Which of these specific issues were most salient for Republicans, I don't know, but these factors combined to help them win 47 House seats and 10 Senate seats. Democrats still had majorities in both houses, but no longer had supermajorities in either one. FDR then won election to a 4th term in 1944. He ran as the war was ongoing and didn't think that the country should change leadership until the war was over. But he died 3 months into his term, so I'll cover that under Successor in part 3. Now let's untangle FDR's long and mixed legacy, starting with his New Deal policies. With the Depression still raging as FDR took office, he knew he needed to act quickly, so he called a special session of Congress and passed many important laws in the first 100 days. First, he declared a bank holiday to prevent bank runs and created the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which gives the government guarantee that depositors will not lose their money they put into banks. Because of the way fractional reserve banking works, if a bank run happens, even a totally solvent bank can run out of money. Let's say a bank receives $1 million in deposits and gives out $900,000 to people taking out loans. Even if those loans will be paid back, if the depositors ask for their $1 million back, the bank won't have the money to immediately repay it and it will have to close. But with the government as a lender of last resort, this won't happen. Thousands of sound banks that just closed to avoid a run reopened immediately, and with confidence in the financial institutions restored, bank runs stopped. Then more banks reopened, with some receiving FDIC money if needed, and instead of a downward spiral, there was a positive feedback loop. This ended the Depression, and the long road to recovery began. Now, the FDIC and powers of the Fed to prop up big banks are controversial because they create a moral hazard and can make banks too big to fail. I'll certainly cover this in more detail when we get to the Great Recession. But FDR didn't just prop up big banks, he also regulated them. He signed the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking.
If a bank used funds to invest in the stock market, then it would not be allowed to lend to consumers or have FDIC protection. This regulation was repealed in 1999, and less than a decade later, the Great Recession happened. But until this repeal, the law helped stabilize the banking system, so a great move by FDR. To stimulate the economy, FDR repealed the Volstead Act, which enforced prohibition. This made jobs in the alcohol industry no longer in the black market, reducing crime. He also created numerous government jobs programs. The Tennessee Valley Authority built several dams to provide energy to the region, helped improve crop yields by creating fertilizer, and replanted forests and conducted other conservation programs. Similar jobs were created by the Civilian Conservation Corps across the country, while the Public and Civil Works Administrations, which later turned into the Works Progress Administration, created a lot of infrastructure jobs, but also some jobs in the arts or non-manual labor, as not everyone can work in construction. A few other stimulus measures included suspending the gold standard and issuing fiat money to end deflation, and giving home and farm owners mortgage relief so they didn't lose their homes. These were all great actions which were necessary given how dire the Great Depression was. Austerity measures would have instead let the economy continue to contract and worsen the deflationary spiral. But some programs in the first 100 days were controversial. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, met with opposition from both sides of the aisle. It weakened antitrust legislation, angering progressives, but it also created tons of regulation, so conservatives disliked it. And it was unanimously found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court for giving too much power to the executive branch and denying due process for business owners subject to the regulations, and is widely considered a failure. Now, some of the regulations were positive, like the ending of child labor, a minimum wage, and maximum working hours, but the act also set prices at government levels instead of letting the free market operate. The Agricultural Adjustment Act also had good intent. It acknowledged that there had been overproduction ever since Hoover signed the Agricultural Marketing Act and made the government no longer the buyer of last resort, but went too far the other way. The government paid farms to decrease their output, and many farmers prematurely slaughtered animals to avoid having to feed them or burn their crops as fuel. Meanwhile, other parts of the country had starving people, and the only reason crop prices were so low is because consumers couldn't afford higher prices. And Southern Democrats made sure farm owners were paid to decrease output instead of farm workers, so they fired black workers and pocketed the extra money for themselves. Big farms were also more able to manage the balance of farming some of their land and not other parts, so this law also helped big businesses more than smaller ones. Additionally, the way these payments were funded were by taxing processors of farm products, and in 1936, the Supreme Court ruled that this use of taxing and spending was not for the general welfare, but as a form of regulation, making it unconstitutional. Still, the majority of the programs in the first 100 days were very successful. While all the spending led to the debt doubling between 1932 and 1937, it was worth it with a massive increase in GDP of an average of 11% between 1934 and 36. Policies passed after the first 100 days included banking regulations, such as the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Reciprocal Tariff Act, which undid the damage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and programs to make it easier to build houses or afford mortgages. Clearly, FDR had a great economic policy in the first New Deal. After the resounding success in the 1934 midterms, the second New Deal continued to the approach of the first and became even more progressive. The first major piece of legislation was Social Security, which gives pensions to the disabled and Americans over 65. Now, this might make lefties watching mad, but this is a bad act. It's funded by regressive payroll taxes. The ultra-wealthy make most of their money from investments, which aren't subject to the payroll tax, and there's even a payroll tax cap that means someone making $200K in salary today pays as much as someone making $10 million, so even that portion is regressive. Additionally, by giving money to the elderly and taking from those working, it's basically a Ponzi scheme. While it was fully funded at the time, now that lifespans have increased but the population has stopped growing, the ratio of those receiving benefits to those paying in has increased. The age was raised to 67, and the payroll tax rate has gone to 12% from only 2% when the program was created. Now, removing the payroll tax cap is a simple solution that would help bridge this gap, but there are even more issues with the law. It fundamentally hurts everyone currently alive and only helped the old people alive during the early years of the program who receive much more than they paid in. It's also regressive in its payouts, as people with longer lifespans, who obviously tend to be better off, will receive more money than someone who dies earlier in life, and a working class person in their 40s won't receive any money and will have to pay in, worsening their financial situation. A billionaire who lives to 100 will receive 3 times as much benefit as someone who lives to 78, while paying less than 3 times as much given the payroll tax cap and non-salary wages if the person who lives to 78 made anything over $50K a year during their lifetime. And it takes money out of the economy from younger workers who are more likely to make big purchases like a house, or even small purchases like going out to dinner, and give it to the elderly who are less likely to put it back into the economy. I hope that's enough arguments against Social Security. That doesn't mean I'm against defunding it now, as obviously the people who paid into the program deserve to get their money back. But besides increasing the payroll tax cap, I wouldn't want to expand the program further. FDR also increased income taxes with the Revenue Act of 1935, taking the top rate from 63% to 79%. Now, this didn't increase rates on anyone making less than $50K at the time, which would be over $750K a year in today's money. So this was a very progressive tax. But 79% might be past the rate at which the Laffer curve is true, which means the tax would hurt the economy and even decrease revenue, so I'm not a huge fan of this tax hike either.
FDR also enacted a corporation tax on undistributed profits. This also likely hurt the economy, as undistributed profits by definition are reinvested in the company instead of being paid out to the owners and help the company grow in the future. This act was widely disliked and repealed after the 1938 midterms. Why were all these new taxes passed? Well, FDR wanted to reduce the deficit. I actually do care about the deficit, unlike many people left of me who might believe in modern monetary theory, but the debt to GDP ratio was 34.1% in 1933, when the economy was at its worst, and 33.9% in 1937. So there was no need to add new taxes when everything seemed to be working fine. In fact, FDR even vetoed payments to World War I veterans in the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act. Again, I acknowledge FDR had his reasons for this veto, and I've criticized Harrison for increasing pensions to Civil War veterans. But when Harrison did that, Arthur and Hayes had already increased their pensions, and those veterans weren't suffering from the Great Depression. So I would have signed this bill myself, and I give FDR some criticism for his veto, although it was overridden by Congress, so it was ultimately meaningless. Finally, for some more criticism, FDR replaced the first Agriculture Adjustment Act after the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. But the second one had the same goals, just with slightly different methods. This act resumed subsidies to farmers, this time for planting regenerative crops, and also bought excess crops, something the previous act hadn't done. This began the subsidy system that's still in place today for farmers. The subsidies are mainly given for quote-unquote staple crops, such as unhealthy grains like wheat and corn, and also soy, which is then mainly used as animal feed. This discourages farmers from planting healthier fruits and vegetables, so it contributes to our obesity epidemic, and most of the subsidies go to big agricultural companies rather than small family farms, so I view this as a negative just like the first one. But let me be positive about the second New Deal now. There were better farm policies, such as the Soil Conservation Act, which ended the Dust Bowl by protecting the environment, and the introduction of food stamps, which encourage Americans to eat healthier, reduce poverty, and help farmers, but in a better way. Many pro-labor reforms were also passed, such as the creation of the National Labor Relations Board via the Wagner Act, which ensures companies allow unions to operate and don't exploit their workers, and regulations on child labor, minimum wages, and more, now that the NIRA was ruled unconstitutional. More regulations were passed, including increasing the power of the FDA, FTC, and Interstate Commerce Commission, and creating the Federal Communications Commission. And more jobs programs in infrastructure, arts, and public services, and more programs to promote house and farm constructions and mortgages were passed. So I don't think everything in the second New Deal went too far. But overall, there were certainly way more faults than the first one. And after his sweeping re-election in 1936, FDR believed he had enough of a mandate to pack the Supreme Court, which had ruled some of his programs unconstitutional, and tried to add 5 new justices to the court for every justice currently over 70 years old. But VP Garner and most congressional Democrats opposed the bill. FDR ended up appointing 8 justices to the court during his 12 years, so the Lochner era ended anyway. But his support for this move, which violated the checks and balances in our system, was a clear negative. And the economy also tanked after 1936. Growth went from averaging 11% in the 3 prior years to just 5.1% in 1937 and a contraction of 3.3% in 1938. These two things then led to the 1938 midterms, which saw many New Dealers get defeated and replaced by conservative or moderate Republicans. Democrats still retained a majority in both the House and Senate, but this included many conservative Southern Democrats, while almost all progressive Republicans had left the party by this point. So the midterm marked the end of the New Deal policies. FDR was still clearly a positive on the economy, but I do think he went too far in some areas of regulation and taxation, and the court packing was also clearly a mistake. Another reason FDR stopped passing New Deal policies at this point is that World War II began ramping up. What were his actions on the war? I think people know enough about World War II and the rise of Nazi Germany, so I'm not going to cover the events leading up to it in much detail, and just focus on the US's role. Fighting began with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and the US joined after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. What was FDR's position before the war began? Well, like Hoover, he did not like Hitler, but was constrained by neutrality laws and the isolationist sentiment in Congress. The Neutrality Act of 1935, which FDR signed so isolationists would continue supporting his New Deal programs, forbade the US from shipping arms to sides in any combat. This did not distinguish between the aggressor and the victim. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, like Hoover with conflicts in Manchuria, FDR said the invasion was bad, but did not intervene in any way. He and most Americans were also outraged by Japan's invasion of China in 1937, which included the rape of Nanking. Again, the US did not intervene, but it was clear that when they intervened in the war, they were going to be against Japan and Italy. Germany annexed part of Czechoslovakia with the Munich Agreement in 1938, but Britain and France supported it, so FDR also let that happen. But in preparation for war, like Wilson, FDR increased military spending before entering the war. The US military was enlarged to the maximum size allowed by the treaties during Hoover's administrations. During World War I, FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so he was a strong supporter of naval expansion. In his 1939 budget before the war started, the US spent nearly $1.4 billion in military spending, double of what they spent between 1923 and 1934. Spending increased to $1.66 billion in 1940, then exploded to $67 billion by 1943 after the US joined the war. But before the US joined the war and after war broke out in Europe, FDR intervened in non-military ways by relaxing the Neutrality Acts. After 1939, The US could now sell goods to countries involved in war, but not give loans, a compromise that pacified many congressmen who were mad that the World War I loans had still not been repaid. The US was still officially neutral, but FDR was good friends with Churchill, and the sales after the relaxation were almost all to France and Britain. This also ended the recession of 1938 by increasing US exports and GDP, while not increasing the deficit as the goods were directly paid for. France fell in 1940, and the public in Congress were now clearly pro-Britain after they heard news about the brutality of Germany. FDR then began a peacetime draft in September 1940. Once again, drafts are bad, so I'm against this. He then won re-election, and though his victory was narrower than 1932 and 1936, he believed he had received a vote of confidence and began intervening more in his foreign policy. In early 1941, he made a speech framing the war as one between democracies and autocracies, and the country now supported more intervention to help Britain. In March 1941, FDR signed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the US to give out loans to nations in battle once again. After Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June, the US also began supplying the Soviets with arms and food to fight off the Nazis. The economy grew by an incredible 17.7% in 1941, but some of this was also an increase in military spending to 5.5% of GDP from only 1.7% the year prior. FDR also gave aid to Chinese nationalists and Vietnamese communists fighting Japan. The US received rubber imports from Vietnam, so even though France, which had colonized Vietnam and its neighbors, didn't really want the US to support the freedom fighters, the US cared more about winning World War II. The US also ended its exports of oil, iron, and steel to Japan. Japan then invaded Siberia and Indonesia to find oil fields, and after the US began militarizing the Philippines, Japan knew they had to strike before the US was ready and attacked Pearl Harbor. With almost all Americans behind the war, FDR declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. The US then ramped up military spending in 1942 to 17.4% of GDP. Draftees also now began being deployed, but the early war didn't go very well. Japan was more prepared for the war and conquered most of Southeast Asia before US reinforcements could come, forcing US forces in the Philippines to retreat to Australia. And Germany started attacking US ships with U-boats, making it difficult to transport goods safely to Europe with most of the naval resources deployed in the Pacific theater. But once Alan Turing cracked the Enigma code the Germans were using, the US and the UK were able to read German communications and gain the upper hand. The US deployed more planes to the Atlantic, sank dozens of U-boats, and the Germans mostly withdrew. Germany also began the brutal Battle of Stalingrad against the USSR, which caused both sides to lose tons of manpower and resources. In 1943, the US further increased military spending to 36% of GDP, and it stayed there until the war ended. Victories came in North Africa and Sicily, and in July, the King of Italy forced Mussolini to resign and surrender, leaving just Germany and Japan. The US then began bombing raids on Germany and prepared to deploy troops to France. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944 was successful, and the advance continued. Paris was recaptured on August 25th, and Allied forces entered Germany in September. They captured the Ruhr Valley in March 1945, and after FDR died on April 12th, the war in Europe ended with Mussolini's execution on the 28th, Hitler's suicide on the 30th, and the surrender of Germany on May 11th. Improvement also came in the Pacific against Japan after 1942. Instead of unprepared and poorly equipped soldiers in the Philippines, the US sent their powerful Navy and Air Force and had much more success against Japan. The first major victory was the Battle of Midway in June 1942, but success accelerated in 1943, with the Battle of Bismarck Sea in March and Battle of Tarawa in November. The US took back small islands one at a time, a strategy known as island hopping, and used them as bases of operations to launch aerial bombing campaigns on Japan. By the end of 1944, the Philippines and most other islands had been recaptured, with just the invasion of Japan left. But Japan continued to be brutal, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in Manila before their defeat, and employing suicide bombers and refusing to surrender. The US finally found success in Japan, raising the flag at Iwo Jima in a very famous picture, but sustained many losses. After FDR died, the Soviet Union was ready to also invade Japan, but Truman decided to drop the atomic bombs to force a surrender and end the war with no further Allied losses. We'll discuss that decision next time. Overall, the war strategy was quite successful, and all three opposing nations were soundly defeated. And I don't blame FDR for not getting Germany and Japan to surrender sooner like Wilson did, as Hitler and Emperor Hirohito of Japan were much more ruthless than the opposition in World War I, who had legitimate reasons for fighting and weren't bloodthirsty genocidal maniacs outside of the Ottoman Empire, who committed the Armenian genocide. So FDR gets great grades for navigating domestic opposition to the war, not joining too early, growing the economy, and running the war well. But I didn't mention the domestic policies during the war, such as Japanese internment and FDR's response to the Holocaust, so let's now cover those. After the war began in 1939, like Woodrow Wilson during World War I, FDR cracked down on civil liberties. In 1940, he signed the Smith Act, which required all aliens to apply for visas and be fingerprinted, criminalized anyone who advocated overthrowing the US government, which was later ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and allowed the government to deport more non-citizens. He also created the Office of Censorship right after Pearl Harbor, and told FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to increase investigations of dissidents. And the most well-known violation of civil liberties was Japanese internment. FDR signed an executive order forcing hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans to be sent to internment camps in the middle of nowhere. While the US didn't put them through forced labor or kill them, this was still clearly racist, unconstitutional, and a huge negative. There was also some internment of Germans and Italians, but they were mostly foreign nationals, while Japanese citizens were widely interned, making that much worse. All these were terrible decisions that hurt FDR's grade. To pay for the war, he also further increased taxes. The Revenue Act of 1941 took the bottom tax bracket from 4% to 10%, and in 1942, it was then raised to 19%. Workers demanded raises, and prices then increased, leading to double-digit inflation during the war. This inflation did help reduce the real value of the national debt, as I've discussed many times with the idea of negative real interest rates, but inflation obviously also has downsides. But since this tax increase was necessary to pay for the war, I won't really criticize it. Even with these tax increases, the debt to GDP ratio shot up to 100% from 33% in 1937. There was also rationing of goods such as gas, rubber, and leather during the war, but that was also necessary, so once again, I won't criticize it. The economy grew by 17.5% annually between 1941 and 43, then 8% in 1944, before a post-war contraction between 1945 and 1949. The post-war recession proved that some of the growth was temporary and fueled by massive deficits in war spending, but some of it was also long-lasting. Unemployment fell to 2%, even with many women entering the workforce, and the US became a world leader in manufacturing. FDR also started the Manhattan Project that built the first nuclear weapons. Germany was trying to build one during the war, and the Soviets did build them afterwards, so even if you dislike nukes, it's still good that the US has them, as otherwise the USSR would have won a hot war instead of losing the Cold War. In 1944, FDR signed the GI Bill, which funded colleges or job training programs for World War II veterans, avoiding mass unemployment when they all came home from war. This helped the US stay an economic superpower after the war. In all of these decisions, FDR's economic management during the war was great. He also created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which prohibited racial and religious discrimination by defense contractors. Black unemployment drastically decreased under FDR's tenure, and many of them moved to big cities in the north to find jobs. The military remained segregated under FDR, but Truman would also change that, and afterwards, black people in the north then started voting Democratic. FDR also repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 now that China was an ally of the US in the fight against Japan. The US became hostile to China after the communists won the Civil War, but FDR was not to blame for that. But given he was very anti-Japanese, I think this was more of a political statement than out of genuine goodwill and anti-racism. On Jews, FDR had a more mixed record. He allowed all German and Austrian Jews in the US to stay indefinitely and accepted more as allowed by the Immigration Act of 1924. But the law meant many Jews from Eastern Europe were unable to immigrate to the US, and though FDR repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, he kept this Immigration Act in place. In 1939, he even prevented 900 refugees on the MS St. Louis from entering the country. Some entered other European countries, but others returned to Germany and were killed. In 1944, FDR created the War Refugee Board and accepted more refugees, but it was too little too late. So though he was the best president on civil rights since at least Harrison, FDR's Japanese internment was clearly bad, and he was mediocre for Jews, making him overall average on race. On other foreign policy, FDR was anti-imperialist. He wanted Britain and France to give up their colonies in India, Vietnam, and more, but they refused. India only became independent after Churchill lost re-election, and Vietnam had to fight the French for its own independence. And once the war ended, the Soviet Union ensured many Eastern European countries joined them by installing puppets who would assent to annexations. FDR didn't push back against this, as he still needed support for a possible invasion of Japan. But when FDR had full control over the issue, he did follow through on his anti-imperialism. In 1934, the US passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which promised Filipino independence in 10 years, though it was delayed 2 years by the Japanese invasion. He also fully withdrew the military from Haiti, following up on Hoover's timeline, and made it so Cuba was no longer a US protectorate. The only US forces left in Latin America were at the Panama Canal or Guantanamo Bay, both of which were US property. After the Reciprocal Tariff Act, he increased trade with Latin American countries, and also created the Export-Import Bank, which allowed the US to fund infrastructure projects abroad. He also continued good relations with Mexico. Hoover's program of deportations largely ended, and after Mexico nationalized their oil, they compensated the US, something the Soviets didn't do in their revolution. Thus, unlike during World War I, Mexico was allied with the US in World War II. But during the war, the Allies did cozy up to Middle Eastern countries to ensure access to oil. FDR met with the King of Saudi Arabia in 1945, built a military base there, and got Saudi Arabia to price their oil exports in dollars in exchange for the US being their ally and buying their oil. The Allies also kept good relations with Iran in exchange for their oil, foreshadowing the coup under Eisenhower. Finally, FDR was vital in establishing multinational organizations like the United Nations, just like Wilson wanted to create the League of Nations. Now, FDR died in April 1945, before the United Nations were actually created, but Truman followed up on his promise. This is why I think it's unfair to criticize Wilson for his post-stroke tenure. He was incapacitated, and the League was unable to pass Congress. But had he died and his VP done better, would his grade be higher? If you would move his grade up if he died sooner, I think that's strange. But back to FDR.
The World Bank and IMF were also created, and the Bretton Woods Conference created fixed exchange rates between currencies. I don't have a strong opinion on any of these organizations or agreements, as they can be used for good to help developing countries that need loans or support, but are often used to benefit the powerful countries that created them. For example, the US uses its veto on the UN Security Council to protect its own illegal wars or crimes by its allies, such as Israeli actions in Palestine. So FDR's actions on these organizations won't affect his grade either way. Now let's sum up everything about his term on one slide, and finally give him his grade. FDR's first New Deal was very positive. The NIRA had more good than bad with all of its good regulations, leaving the Agriculture Adjustment Act as the only negative one, as it led to farmers burning and wasting crops. But the second New Deal was negative, counting FDR's support of court packing in that category. The Soil Conservation Act and food stamps were good, as were the actions on labor, but the recession of 1938 likely happened because of the tax increases, which weren't even needed given the debt to GDP ratio hadn't changed, and I'm not a fan of Social Security or farm subsidies either. But during the war, his economic management was once again fantastic. GDP growth was exceptional, and the debt didn't increase much until the US entered the war, as other countries paid for US exports directly. The tax increases, inflation, and rationing were necessary evils, while the GI Bill was a great move. All put together, he was good, but not great on the economy. But on foreign policy, he was great. I don't think he made any mistakes with his World War II strategy. Isolationist members of Congress ensured he didn't enter the war sooner, but he was able to navigate the situation well, gradually relaxing the Neutrality Acts before the eventual entering of the war. Additionally, he was anti-imperialist in Latin America and the Philippines. But he was poor on civil liberties, approved a draft, and mediocre on race, with the negatives on internment and Jewish immigration, canceling out the good economic policies and fair employment blacks approved of, and the end of Chinese exclusion. With all that in mind, I'm going to put him in A. He simply made too many mistakes for him to be a top 3 president of all time, but the good definitely outweighs the bad. Now let's review all the rankings I've made so far in this series. Here are all the ratings we've done so far. Today we covered Lincoln, who makes S for freeing the slaves and a strong economic policy, but is held back from the top spot by the draft and weak Reconstruction policies. There are also the 3 entrants to A and Taft in B. Grant is clearly the worst of the A's, as civil rights successes were invalidated after 1876, and he has issues on the economy and questions on corruption. When comparing the two Roosevelts, FDR had higher highs, but lower lows. The court packing, draft, and internment weigh him down, and I also think he went too far in some of his New Deal legislation. So even if Teddy wasn't as good as FDR in foreign policy, I still put him higher. Hayes lands next to Quincy Adams. The two were similar, with one notable mistake, deploying the Army Against Strikes for Hayes and the Tariff of Abominations for JQA, versus an otherwise good record, though they didn't get much done. Harrison goes in C for his mixed record, while Arthur, Wilson, Coolidge, and Cleveland all go in C-. Cleveland and Coolidge were certainly below average, as they led to or exacerbated depressions, but Arthur and Wilson could go higher if you give them the benefit of the doubt on civil service reform and blaming the stroke instead of Wilson respectively. Hoover, Harding, and McKinley were all really bad, but the extremely pro-slavery presidents were worse, so they all escape F. But Johnson doesn't. F- is too harsh with his okay economic record and good foreign policy, but he was basically one of the pro-slavery presidents with his abysmal Reconstruction policies. Van Buren wasn't pro-slavery, but he was horrible on pretty much everything, so I think he also belongs in F. At the end of part 3, I'll likely make some adjustments. C- definitely looks too crowded, so I'll change up the tiers a little, but the relative order probably won't change by more than 1 spot for anyone. I'll try to get out the final part by July 4th, but there's no guarantee of that. In it, I'll compare my rankings to what most historians think and see which presidents are the most over and underrated in their lists compared to mine. Leave any opinions about the list so far in the comments, or hit me up on Twitter or Discord to start a discussion. I'd love to hear honest disagreements about my grades, or any facts about these guys that I left out of their segments. While I may have left them out on purpose, there's plenty I don't know about all of these presidents, but I hope that you've learned and now you know more about them. But that's it for today, and I'll see you next time.